Chapter 456. The people of the Directorate, who were filled with righteous indignation and wanted to abolish the new mathematics, could only kneel in the hall and did not dare to raise their heads. The three elders, including the great scholar who was kicked to the ground by Qin Huan, the Minister of Revenue, did not kneel together, but their faces were red with shame. Their decades of reputation had been ruined. If there was a crack in the ground in front of them, they would have crawled into it. The words they used to belittle Li just now could be used on them at this moment. Apart from being frightened, they also found it hard to believe. Was the new mathematics so wonderful that it could make a 9-year-old child surpass a master of mathematics who had been immersed in it for decades? Tell me, what is your fault? After the shock, Emperor Jing's expression had calmed down. He glanced at the people kneeling on the ground and asked lightly, "We should follow your Majesty's orders and should not doubt Li Xianzi's new mathematics." The Chancellor of the Directorate said in a trembling voice, "The calculation method we use is not as good as County Magistrate Li's new calculation method, but what the Directorate has obtained is the new calculation method. As for the problem of selecting the best candidate just mentioned by Prince Jean, not only I have never heard of it, but I'm afraid no one in the entire Directorate or even the whole world has ever heard of it. However, County Magistrate Li is indeed a genius. I sincerely ask your Majesty to allow the Directorate to assign 2 doctors of mathematics to study with the princes." The members of the Imperial College looked at each other for a while and then spoke up one after another. They admitted their mistakes with a sincere attitude and did not mention anything about the admonition just now. They praised the new mathematics and expressed their willingness to learn advanced techniques from Li Xianzi. In summary, the core meaning they wanted to express was that it was not that they were too useless. Everyone had been like this for decades, not only our country but also other countries. They would not take the blame for the previous mistakes. Li Xianzi was so powerful, so it was better to promote the new mathematics as soon as possible. It was not that they did not want to take the blame, but that they could not bear it at all. According to Lord Qin, the National Treasury lost a terrifying amount of money every year. Even if the Directorate sold itself, it would not be able to pay it back. The Minister of War Yan Bing knelt in front of Emperor Jing. His face was ashen as he said in a deep voice, "The military expenditure was not calculated accurately. Even if I were to die 10,000 times, I would not be able to atone for my sins." Emperor Jing personally helped him up. He shook his head and said, "This matter is not your fault. If we really talk about it, I am also at fault. I should have let County Magistrate Li carry out this law in detail. The Ministry of War was not responsible for this. Instead, it was the Directorate that disappointed Emperor Jing. The Directorate is to blame for not paying attention to the new school of mathematics. All officials will be fined a year's salary as punishment." Emperor Jing looked at the people of the Directorate of Studies and said, "In addition, immediately summon the mathematics professors and students of the Directorate of Studies to the palace. I want to see with my own eyes what the mathematics talents of our court are like." He trotted all the way back to his residence. Before Prince Jean Li Han had time to catch his breath, a eunuch issued an edict to summon all the princes and princesses to Bowen Hall. Prince Jean followed the eunuch nervously and saw that several princes were already waiting there. He went forward to ask about the situation and learned that his father was going to test their homework. His heart suddenly thumped. These days he only cared about wandering in the sea of mathematics. How could he remember other homework? In addition to his brothers and sisters, there were more than a dozen strangers in the hall today. It seemed that they were going to take the exam with them. Prince Jean could not help but feel more nervous. After opening the test paper given to him by a eunuch, Prince Jean was stunned. The next moment he showed a relaxed expression. Had chicken and rabbit questions, well questions and rope questions, these were all left over from a long time ago. It did not take him long to solve the answers. The questions at the back were a little good, but they were copied from the booklet given to him by the teacher. Even the numbers were the same. He could write them with his eyes closed. After a quarter of an hour, Li Han put down his pen. His father was watching from a distance and did not dare to do anything out of line. In boredom he looked at the people around him. Shining Imperial Sister frowned. He must have encountered a problem that he could not solve. This was normal. The things taught by the teacher in class were actually very simple. The real hell was actually that booklet that belonged to him. Li Han still thought that the teacher punished him for bullying Yong Ning. Beside him, Li Mo bit the tip of his pen. It seemed that he did not even solve the first question. He deserved it. He actually dared to laugh at him for being fat. So what if he was fat? Being fat did not block his way. This time he was going to lose face in front of his father. Li Xiang, who was next to him, also seemed to have encountered a problem. Li Xiang had always been his loyal follower, so he had to help him no matter what. He would think of a way to let him copy later so that he did not follow him in vain. What were those strangers doing? Why were their foreheads sweating? There were so many ice cubes, but the Bowen Hall was not hot at all. What a group of strange people. Just as Li Han was sitting there drowsily out of boredom, the students of the Imperial College's mathematics department were already drenched in sweat. Looking at the test paper in front of them, they only felt dizzy. Li Lei Han Mimi, the pond, releasing water, entering water, were these really math questions? With doubts about life, everyone only felt that even the future had become gray. In a secluded corner of the hall, Jing Emperor and the Minister of Revenue, Qin Huan, stood there with a test paper in their hands. The people of the Imperial College stood aside obediently. They had long lost their arrogance. Your Majesty, the questions that Li Xianzi has set are really brilliant. They can be used in reality. They make mathematics not just stay on paper. It can be imagined that if the new mathematics can be implemented, it will create a whole new situation. Qin Huan finally looked away from the test paper and said with admiration. As the Minister of Revenue, he was extremely sensitive to numbers and was naturally proficient in mathematics. At this moment he finally couldn't help but speak. Jing Emperor nodded and was not too surprised. He had long been used to Li Yi, who could always create miracles and surprises. Your Majesty, 1 hour is up. Yan Bing stepped forward and reminded. Then let's go and take a look. The princes, princesses, and the mathematics students were all driven out of the Bowen Hall. Except for Prince Jean, almost all the princes and princesses were a little nervous. The questions just now were much more difficult than what they usually did in class. Some of them were even unprecedented. They didn't even move a word. This time they would definitely be reprimanded by their father. Liamo, how did you answer? Li Xiang, how about you? Did you understand the hand gestures I showed you just now? Imperial sister, you? Oh, nothing. The red hairpin you are wearing today is so beautiful. After asking everyone, Li Han finally couldn't suppress the pride on his face. Compared to I in mathematics, you are still far behind. Not far away, several young people from the mathematics department of the Imperial College gathered together. They all had bitter faces. Brother Chen, how was it? How many of the 10 questions did you solve? I'm ashamed, I only answered 3 lines. Not bad. I only wrote 2 lines. To tell you the truth, I only solved 1. Everyone was still confused about His Majesty's inexplicable mathematics exam. Just now, when they saw the questions on the test paper, they felt like they were sitting on pins and needles. At this time, when they learned that everyone's situation was the same, they felt a little relieved. They had never heard of those questions before. Even if they couldn't answer them, it was understandable. Everyone's level was similar, so no one could laugh at each other. It was just strange why His Majesty let these princes and princesses take the exam with them. They were just some naughty children. Did they know what mathematics was? They probably couldn't even understand those questions, right? As the students were thinking about this, they suddenly saw several professors coming out of the hall. The leader of the group, Si Yi, had a gloomy expression, causing them to have a bad premonition. Chapter 457. The dignified mathematics students of the Imperial College are not even as good as the young princes. What a good Imperial College. The Minister of Revenue, Qin Huan, came out of the hall and said with a sullen face. The officials of the Imperial College lowered their heads and did not dare to say a word to refute. Today the Imperial College lost face in front of His Majesty. It was the same exam, but the mathematics students' results were comparable to a group of 7 or 8-year-old princes. Moreover, they were left far behind by the slightly older Princess Shaning and Prince Jean. If this matter was spread out, the Imperial College would not be able to raise their heads in front of people in the future. Teacher, a student summoned up the courage to ask a doctor of mathematics. The other party coldly said with a sullen face, "Why are you still standing here? Haven't you lost face enough? Go back." The mathematics students, who were confused after being scolded, saw the faces of several teachers. They immediately did not dare to say another word and left with their tails between their legs. An incredible thought emerged in the hearts of more than a dozen people at the same time. Could it be that the little princes and princesses really solved those abnormal problems that even they could not solve? They wanted to ask, but when they saw the cold faces, they did not dare to speak. When they thought of what Minister Qin had just said, they only felt that their faces were burning in the Bowen Hall. The princes and princesses lowered their heads and surrounded Emperor Jing. They knew that their father, the emperor, would not be satisfied with this exam, so they carefully did not dare to speak. As for Prince Jin Li Han, he raised his head high and looked at the world with disdain. As the only person who answered all 10 questions correctly, he had such confidence. Princess Shining was the most lively. She did not seem to care at all. She put an iced grape into Emperor Jing's mouth and asked with a smile, "Father, this grape is very sweet, right?" Emperor Jing smiled, looked at the crowd and said, "Father is very satisfied with this exam. Don't stand here, go and play." The princes and princesses were relieved when they didn't hear the admonishment they had imagined. In an instant they dispersed. Only Prince Jin Li Han stayed. He looked up at Emperor Jing as if he had something to say. Is there anything else?" Emperor Jing looked at Li Han and asked with a smile. When Li Yi told him that Prince Jin was very talented in mathematics, he didn't care much. However, this time he deeply realized that the former gluttonous and playful little fatty was actually taught to this degree by Li Yi. "Imperial father, I think." Li Han was hesitating whether or not to tell his imperial father that he didn't want to attend math classes in the future. Emperor Jing once again smiled and said, "Your teacher once told imperial father that Han is very talented in math. Han should be more diligent in the future. Perhaps imperial father will need Han help in many areas." What? Monarch Jin was obviously shocked by the news and he was stunned. Teacher had told father that he was very talented in mathematics? How was this possible? Teacher only knew how to torture him with those difficult questions. Why would he praise him in front of his father? Seeing that Monarch Jin was stunned, Emperor Jing touched his head and said, Okay, Han, what's the matter? Say it quickly. No. Imperial father, I'm going out to play. This accident made him forget what he was going to say. Monarch Jin's face showed a proud expression. He grabbed a few grapes from the plate on the side and ran out of the hall. Emperor Jing smiled and watched him run away. When his eyes fell on the stack of examination papers again, his face gradually showed a thoughtful expression. Why are you here? Li Yi looked at Li Xian, who came in from the outside, and asked in surprise. It's boring to stay in the prince's residence, so I came to take a look. Li Xian said casually, but he looked at the things in Li Yi's hands. He curiously asked, What are you doing? Aren't you grounded? Li Yi asked in confusion. Yes. Li Xian nodded and looked at Li Yi strangely. Does it matter? It doesn't matter. Li Yi shook his head. Even the world belonged to their big family. Being grounded was just a casual remark from the old emperor. It had nothing to do with whether Li Xian was in the prince's mansion or not. Li Xian looked at the rags in Li Yi's hands and lost interest in them. He ran out of the kitchen to get a pot of grape wine and moved a chair to sit next to Li Yi. He took a sip and said, When I was a child, I was always bullied by the king of Shu. This time I finally got revenge. If there are such good things in the future, remember to call me. Come on. Li Yi lowered his head and continued to work. He didn't even look at him. He said, How you fight with the king of Shu is the royal family's business. If I beat the king of Shu again, who knows where my head will be. Then why were you so bold last time? Li Xian turned to look at him. He was still very curious about this matter. Hysteria. Li Yi said in a serious tone. He then asked, How's the activity in the court these few days? Nothing much. Li Xian shook his head and said, The king of Shu is not honorable himself in this matter, so those people won't make a big deal out of it. Other than the initial clamor to severely punish the two of us, no one has talked about it in the court these days. Those people? Li Yi raised his eyebrows and suddenly became interested. He asked, Who are they? Li Xian looked at him and said, Of course it's Prime Minister Qin and those officials close to the king of Shu. That day they were also the ones who made the most noise in the court, such as the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Rights, the Chancellor of the Directorate. Wait a minute. What are you going to do? Seeing Li Yi suddenly get up and walk into the room, Li Xian asked in confusion. Get a pen and paper. After a while, seeing that Li Yi actually took out a small booklet, Li Xian was stunned. Does anyone have anything else to report? The morning court was about to end. Emperor Jing sat on the dragon chair and asked as usual. There were not many things worth discussing in the court today, except for the fact that the third prince of the Qi kingdom had brought a group of capable people from the Qi kingdom to stir up trouble in the capital city. They had visited all the famous Confucian scholars, causing all the Confucian scholars to feel insecure and simply shut themselves in their rooms. However, there was nothing he could do about it. He couldn't just chase them all out. After all, they didn't go overboard in their actions. They discussed knowledge openly and won fair and square. Even if there were many rumors about this among the people, The confidence that they gained from defeating the kingdom of Qi was greatly reduced. Standing at the level of the imperial court, there was no effective way to reverse or change the situation. I have a report. The assistant minister of the Ministry of Rites, Qin Bo, walked out of the crowd with a ceremonial tablet in his arms. He said loudly, "I heard that the county magistrate of Chang and Li Yi was ordered by His Majesty to teach mathematics to the princes. However, county magistrate Li is only a scholar. The new mathematics that he advocated is crooked and has been rejected by the Imperial College. How can a mere scholar teach the princes? It is not in accordance with etiquette and etiquette." Assistant Minister Chen from the Ministry of Rites said a lot. The officials had different thoughts. Emperor Jing was expressionless. The Chancellor of the Imperial College's mouth twitched. He wished he could sew Assistant Minister Chen's mouth. The Imperial College had just lost face in front of His Majesty the previous day. Several mathematics professors spent the night studying the new mathematics. After all, this time it was pardonable, but if something were to happen again, it would not be just a punishment of a year's salary forfeiture. Assistant Minister Chen's words undoubtedly dragged the Imperial College out again and roasted them on the fire. Chapter 458. The Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Rites, Qin Bo, stood out to make things difficult for Li Xianzi, which was not unexpected. As an important figure in Duke Chen's mansion and a staunch supporter of the King of Shu, Qin Bo could not convict Li Xianzi of beating up a prince, but he had to find a way to do something about it. However, they did not expect that he would choose to break through like this, which was really unexpected. Even if Li Xianzi really had great talent, he was too young. He was neither the Grand Tutor nor the Grand Tutor. Of course, he was not a famous Confucian scholar. However, it was indeed difficult for him to be the teacher of the princes at such a young age. Because many times being young was a mistake. "Oh, this is the imperial court. Assistant Minister Chen, you have to have evidence to speak. How can Li Xianzi's new mathematics be crooked?" Suddenly, a voice came out of the silence, which attracted the attention of the people. "Minister Qin?" Seeing that figure, the officials were immediately filled with doubts. The first person to stand up for Li Xianzi was not Li Mingzi, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Personnel, nor Yan Bing, the Minister of War, nor the old general who was very protective of him. It was Minister Qin of the Ministry of Revenue? Not only were the officials surprised, but Qin Bo also did not expect that the Minister of Revenue, who had never participated in the struggle in the imperial court, would suddenly intervene. Depressed, he said again, "Minister Qin, whether my words have evidence or not, you only need to ask Minister Zheng of the Imperial College." Working in the imperial court, the most terrible thing was to be isolated and helpless. He had long expected that there would be opposition, and a few days ago, Qin Bo found himself a reliable ally. The Chancellor of the Imperial College was more qualified than him to speak on this matter in the entire imperial court. Hearing this, the officials could not help but secretly despise him. In the imperial court, everyone knew that the Chancellor of the Imperial College was a disciple of Prime Minister Qin and also a staunch supporter of the King of Shu. How could he stand up for Li Xianzi at this time? In that case, Minister Zheng, how crooked is Li Xianzi's new mathematics? At this time, Emperor Jing's voice came out. The Chancellor of the Directorate felt extremely bitter in his heart. If it were not for yesterday's incident, he would definitely stand on the side of Assistant Minister Qin Bo of the Ministry of Rites. But the problem was that the Directorate of the Directorate had a guilty conscience. The Emperor had already given them a chance yesterday. If they did not grasp it well, not only would he lose his position as Chancellor, but the entire Directorate of the Directorate would also be finished. Qin Bo, the Assistant Minister of Ministry of Rites, was originally smiling confidently. But as the Chancellor of the Imperial College spoke, his smile froze and his face gradually turned pale. He turned his head and looked at Chancellor Zheng, who was still speaking highly of Li Xianzi. His mind went blank. He did not understand. They had agreed that after he brought up this topic, Chancellor Zheng would stand up and denounce the new mathematics. At that time, there would be countless colleagues who would speak up and push this matter to the end. This was the first step to deal with Li Yi. Only after this step was taken could the subsequent plan be carried out. But, what was Chancellor Zheng putting on this show again? After Chancellor Zheng spoke, the officials were also stunned. Did Chancellor Zheng take the wrong medicine today? Why did he speak up for the county magistrate of Chang'an? Or did he have a grudge against Qin Bo? But weren't he and Assistant Minister Chen close to the King of Shu? Why would he embarrass Assistant Minister Chen in front of His Majesty and the officials? Among the officials, Qin Qing and Qin Chong frowned. This was because Qin Bo had not only lost his face, but also the face of the Qin family. What was wrong with Chancellor Zheng? Why did he suddenly change sides? In front of the officials, Prime Minister Qin was expressionless. It was impossible to tell whether he was happy or angry. However, many officials looked at the Chancellor of the Imperial College with slightly angry expressions. His performance today had completely exceeded their expectations. Minister Qin, do you have anything else to say? After the Chancellor of the Imperial College finished speaking, Emperor Jing looked at Qin Bo and asked again. I have nothing to say. Qin Bo's face turned green and white. He gritted his teeth and spoke. Not long after, the officials walked out of the hall one after another. Chancellor Zheng stood in front and wanted to explain to Assistant Minister Qin. Unexpectedly, when Assistant Minister Qin walked past him, he only snorted coldly and strode away. He stood in the same place and his expression changed for a while. Finally, he flicked his sleeves and left. 10 more days. Li Yi counted the days with his fingers. He turned his head to look at Li Xian and said, "Why don't you go into the palace and tell His Majesty that Yongning's condition has just improved? The environment in the palace is harmful to her condition. Can she be taken out for treatment?" Li Xian rolled his eyes at him and said, "I am still grounded by Uncle Huang and can only stay in the Crown Prince's residence. How can I go into the palace to see him?" Li Yi shook his head. It seemed that he could not rely on this matter. However, he had waited for a year. A few more days did not matter. He lowered his head and continued to busy himself with the work at hand. Outside the courtyard, there was the sound of light footsteps approaching. Martial Uncle. Yang Liuqing stood at the door with a smile on his face. When Li Yi and Rui and Li Yi came to the capital from Qing and Prefecture, Yang Liuqing did not go with them. He stayed in Qing and Prefecture to help with the matters of the hero list. Mississippi Lu's female army also stayed there. This time they came with Wan Ruoqing. Other than them, the real backbone of the brothel had completed the transfer from Qing and Prefecture to the capital. Old Sun, who was eager to develop, had long been impatient with them. Wan Ruoqing did not come to the Viscount's manor. Instead, she had Yang Liuqing bring a letter. "It's finally here." Li Yi finished reading her letter and put it back into the envelope. He raised his head to look at the distant sky and murmured in a low voice, "It's your luck to be able to enter the Qin manor. Keep your eyes open and work honestly. Don't look at things you shouldn't see and don't ask things you shouldn't ask. Otherwise, getting kicked out would be a light punishment. Do you all hear me?" In the Qin manor, a fat housekeeper stood with his hands on his hips. He pointed at the dozen or so new servants in the manor. "Yes." The servants said timidly. "Speak louder. Have you all not eaten?" The fat housekeeper asked with a frown. "Yes." "Qin Gue, what are you doing?" A voice came from behind. The fat housekeeper turned his head to look. In the next moment, a flattering smile appeared on his serious face. He said, "Fifth Master, the manor has been short on manpower recently. These are the new batch of servants we hired today." With that, he turned his head again. He looked at the group of servants and said, "Open your eyes wide and look carefully. This is the fifth master of the family. Quickly greet the fifth master." Hearing this, the new servants hurriedly bowed to the fifth master of the Qin manor. "Housekeeper Gue, where do you want to put these bags?" At this time, a figure with only half his head exposed walked over from behind. He carried several large bags on his shoulders and turned his head to ask the fat housekeeper. "Kitchen, kitchen. How many times do I have to say it? Put it in the kitchen." The fat housekeeper kicked the man's butt and said, "You only grow your body, but who knows where your brain has gone?" "Okay." The large man didn't get angry after being kicked. He responded and continued forward. "Wait a moment." The Qin clan's fifth master suddenly spoke. He looked at him and asked, "What is your name?" Replying to master, "This little one is Wu Er." The man replied with a simple and honest smile. The housekeeper called Qin Gue hastily said, "Fifth master, this is the distant nephew of old man Wu who repairs the garden. He came to seek shelter with old man Wu. I saw that he had some strength, so I had him come to the manor to do some odd jobs to eat." The Qin clan's fifth master thought for a moment and said, "I just happen to be lacking someone who can use strength. You can make the arrangements." Qin Gue was stunned for a moment, then he immediately nodded and said, Okay. Don't worry, fifth master. I will make the arrangements in a moment." Having said that, he kicked the man's butt and said, "What are you waiting for? It is your good fortune that fifth master has taken a fancy to you. Hurry up and thank fifth master." The man gave a simple smile and promptly said, "Thank you, fifth master. Thank you, fifth master." The Qin clan's fifth master waved his hand and turned to leave. The fat housekeeper looked at the man and smacked his lips. He said, "Following fifth master is much better than doing odd jobs. Boy, you are really lucky." The other servants all looked at the large man with envious expressions. He had just entered the Qin manor and was already valued by an old master. His starting point was much, much higher than theirs. The man didn't seem to care about this. He carried the bags on his back and left with a simple smile. After walking 2 steps, he turned back and scratched his head with one hand. He asked, "Housekeeper Gue, I forgot to ask. Where are these bags?" Chapter 459. Young master, there are several people outside saying that they are from the Imperial College. They want to see you. They have been waiting there for almost an hour. Fang leaned against the gate of the courtyard and looked inside. Imperial College? Li did not raise his head. Wasn't the Imperial College a firm supporter of the King of Shu? Why did they come to see him? Did they bring any gifts? I don't think so. Fang thought for a moment, then shook his head and said, "Then tell them that I'm not here. Let them go." Li waved his hand impatiently. It was their first time to visit, and they did not even know the most basic etiquette. How could they be called Imperial College doctors? Where were all the books of sages and sages? Didn't the sages teach them to bring gifts when visiting others? Fang took the order and walked out of the gate. He said to the people beside the carriage, "My young master is not here. You can leave." He's not here? The professors from the Imperial College looked at each other in dismay. Li Xianzi was grounded at home by His Majesty and could not go anywhere. Even if he wanted to brush them off, he should at least find a decent reason. People under the eaves had to lower their heads. No matter how angry they were, they still had to maintain etiquette. They cupped their hands and said, "Please help us to inform him that the Imperial College Doctors of Arithmetic are here to learn new arithmetic from Li Xianzi by His Majesty's order." "Do you guys not understand what I'm saying?" Fang said impatiently, "My young master said that he is not here. You better go back to where you came from." After saying that, Fang turned around and walked inside. He did not forget to remind the 2 guards at the gate, "In the future, keep your eyes open. Don't just come in and inform anyone, especially those who don't bring gifts." "Yes, Supervisor Fang." Fang was now the supervisor of the guards of the Viscount Mansion. Naturally, the 2 guards did not dare to have any objection. Supervisor Fang even dared to reprimand the Imperial College doctors. If they annoyed him, they would definitely suffer. Arrogant. He's too arrogant. A middle-aged man dressed in green had an ashen expression on his face. The directorate of the directorate and the doctor had personally come to visit a county magistrate, but they didn't even enter the main gate. What kind of contempt and humiliation was this? Forget it, forget it. Let's go back first. The leader, Si Yi, waved his hand and said helplessly. Given County Magistrate Li's temperament, today's cold reception was within his expectation. A few days ago in the Imperial Court, the Directorate of Imperial Academy had impeached County Magistrate Li a lot. Of course, it was impossible for County Magistrate Li to welcome him with a smile. However, he did not expect that the other party would be so resolute. The few of them did not even cross the threshold of the Viscount Mansion. In any case, they had to meet Li Xianzi. They couldn't guarantee that their brains wouldn't be intact if they made a mistake in the calculation next time. For the sake of his own head and for the future of the directorate, he had no choice but to swallow his anger. He could only prepare a generous gift the next day before paying a visit. Holding a big doll in her arms, Xiao Huan stood behind Li Yi and watched him busy. On such a hot day, she was unwilling to put down the doll sewn for her by the son-in-law. She held a small doll in her arms and a big one on the bed, which was stuffed with rags. It was very comfortable to sleep with it at night. She used to sleep with the first Mississippi. Later, with the son-in-law, she could only sleep alone. When it was cloudy and thundering, she would be too scared to sleep. These days, she slept much more peacefully with the doll in her arms. "Son-in-law, I've sent those people away." Fang came in from outside again and said, "I think they will come again. What if they bring gifts next time?" "Then leave the gifts and send them away." Li Yi was thinking about whether the bow on the sheep's horns was on the left or the right, so he said casually. Lao Fang nodded and said, "If there's nothing else, I'll go to Old Sun's place to help him. If you need anything, send someone to call me at the brothel in the city." Li Yi waved his hand and said, "Go. There's nothing here. Remember to take a bath when you come back. There's no smell of perfume in the brothel." After a while, Fang went out of the mansion with a smile on his face. He had to go to the brothel. Otherwise, it would be hard to explain to his wife at home. If there was a chance, he would help the second miss and find a few top martial arts masters to fight. At that time he would have something to boast about to Xiao Hong. Is it left or right? If it's only one side, it's not symmetrical. Will it look a little uncomfortable? Looking at the son-in-law who began to talk to himself again, the little maid was a little worried. The son-in-law seemed to be a little strange these days. Did they really say so? In the hall of diligent government, Emperor Jing frowned and asked, I haven't had time to submit the memorial of the envoy of the Qi kingdom to your majesty. An old man dressed in green said, These days they have even spread this matter wantonly in the marketplace. Whether your majesty agrees or not, they won't suffer any losses. If your majesty agrees, then we will inevitably have to compete with them again. If your majesty disagrees, I'm afraid that it will greatly damage the prestige of our empire. This is also what they want to see. Even if I agree, what are our chances of winning? Emperor Jing pondered for a moment and said. The old man smiled bitterly and said, I'm afraid the chances of winning are not big. Prime Minister Qin lost in scripture, Wang Zhong lost in poetry, and Bai Yu played chess with an old man and lost all 3 games. Even if we compete again, we will lose more than we win, let alone the others. There are only a few people in the Qi kingdom. Is there really no one in the Jing kingdom who can be used? Emperor Jing asked with a sullen face. The old man shook his head and said, Your Majesty, you are wrong. Everyone knows that Prime Minister Qin lost in scripture, Poetry Ghost lost in poetry, and Bai Yu lost in chess. But they don't know that the nameless old man who competed with Prime Minister Qin is the famous great literary master of the Qi kingdom 30 years ago. He disappeared and devoted himself to literature for 30 years. How can Prime Minister Qin easily defeat him? In addition, the young man who competed with Wang Zhong in poetry is known as the greatest poet in the past millennium in the Qi kingdom. He is called the poetry saint at a young age. He is more than 10 years younger than Wang Zhong and is at the age when his mind is agile. It is not surprising that he won against Poetry Ghost. Bai Yu's loss was not unjust either. Even his father could not defeat that person back then. The chess soul of the great Qi dynasty had never lost a single time since he was young. How could he live up to his reputation? The old man sighed and said, This time they came with the envoy of the Qi kingdom. It is obvious that they want to embarrass the Jing kingdom in front of the people of the world. They want to win back the face of the defeat on the battlefield. The great literary master of the generation calls himself a nameless old man. The young poetry saint says I am not talented. The famous chess soul of the various countries only says I have played chess for a few years and know a little. What can we do? Being inferior was being inferior. Whether the opponent was the great literary master or the poetry saint, they had suppressed the people of the Jing kingdom. It did not matter who they were. The only thing that mattered was that the people of the Qi kingdom had come to bully them. Should they accept the challenge or not? I don't believe that there is not a single capable person in the vast capital city. After an unknown period of time, Emperor Jing snorted coldly. He waved his sleeve and said, Go and ask them how they want to compete. Chapter 460. One day after the morning assembly, a piece of news spread like wildfire in the marketplace. The emperor had agreed to the Qi kingdom's request for a duel. The duel would be held in the palace the next day. Streets and alleys, brothels. Countless people in the capital city were discussing this matter. Damn the people of the Qi kingdom. How dare they come to our capital city and behave atrociously? We should have taught them a lesson long ago. They want to challenge the entire capital city with just a few people. How arrogant. Tomorrow will be the day to avenge themselves. These days, from the officials and nobles to the commoners, everyone in the capital city had been holding their breaths. Prime Minister Qin had lost, Shirgui had lost, and the chess saint had lost. They had lost to a few nobodies from the Qi kingdom. As citizens of the Jing kingdom, they felt humiliated. Not only were they humiliated, but they also felt aggrieved. They felt aggrieved because they did not use any underhanded tricks at all. Instead, they fought fair and square. With just a few people, they had forced the Confucians to close their doors and hide in their homes, not daring to meet anyone. Even the peddlers selling steamed buns on the street felt ashamed. Now, they could finally regain their dignity and regain their confidence. Everyone was looking forward to defeating those arrogant people in a fair and square manner tomorrow. The people of Qi are arrogant. With just a few people, they want to challenge the entire Jing kingdom. Tomorrow will be the first round of the duel. Is there anyone willing to accept the challenge on behalf of the Jing kingdom? Emperor Jing sat steadily on his throne in the Golden Hall, his gaze sweeping across the officials as he spoke in a clear voice. The generals looked around, their expressions relaxed as if they did not care at all. The duel tomorrow was a battle of words and had nothing to do with them. It was a matter for the rotten Confucians. They just had to wait and watch the show. Their true battlefield was during martial arts battles. The civil officials lowered their heads, afraid that they would be singled out. They did not dare to meet the emperor's eyes. The Qi kingdom's envoy was despicable and cunning. The old man who had said that he had played chess for a few years and only knew a little was a national player. Even the chess saint Baiyu had lost. Who in the imperial court would dare to say that they could win? Baiyu was in the prime of his life and was at the peak of his chess skills. He was publicly acknowledged as the #1 player in the Jing kingdom, yet even he was no match for that person. Who else would dare to step forward at this moment? If they were to lose, they would become a sinner of the Jing kingdom and their reputation would be ruined. No one was willing to take this risk. For a moment, the court, which was supposed to be extremely noisy, fell into a rare silence. Is there really no one in our dynasty who dares to fight? Emperor Jing looked disappointed. In fact, when the envoy of the Qi kingdom made this request, he only had one choice. All the subjects and people in the capital, including the envoys of other countries, were watching another collision between the Qi kingdom and the Jing kingdom under the battlefield. The significance of this competition was related to the backbone of the country and the integrity of the people. It was no less important than a war. Whether the Jing kingdom would surpass the Qi kingdom again and gain great fame or be suppressed by the Qi kingdom and the people would suffer a setback, no matter what the result was, the Jing kingdom could not avoid this competition or the competition. Sigh. Suddenly a sigh was heard in the silent court. A figure walked in from outside the hall, trembling. He bowed to Emperor Jing twice and said, "Your Majesty, I am willing to fight." A eunuch supported the old man with a terrified face. The guards at the door did not even dare to stop him. Grand Tutor Wang. No, no. Your Majesty, Grand Tutor is old. This must not be done. When this old man with white hair and a face full of wrinkles stood out, the officials were stunned for a moment. They immediately burst into an uproar and tried to dissuade him. Grand Tutor Wang was over 80 years old and had served several generations of emperors. In terms of seniority, he was much older than Prime Minister Qin and Prime Minister Shen. He was one of the few old men in the court and did not usually have to attend court. No one knew why he was making an exception today. If this old man were to play chess with the people of Qi, the civil and military officials of the Jing kingdom would not be able to face others in the future. Teacher, why are you? Please have a seat. Emperor Jing stood up from the dragon throne and hurriedly ordered the guards to bring a chair. The old man did not sit down but continued to bow and said, "I am not talented, but I have played chess for a few years. Since no one in the imperial court is willing, why don't you let me play? I hope your Majesty agrees." Emperor Jing walked down from the throne and said with a bitter smile, "Teacher, why do you have to do this?" The old man sighed and said, "We cannot let outsiders think that there is no one in the Jing kingdom." When the old man's aged voice sounded, the officials looked ashamed. At this moment, a figure walked out from the crowd and bowed and said, "Your Majesty, I am willing to fight." Deputy Prime Minister Ma? Why would Deputy Prime Minister Ma? That's right, only Ma Zhongqing can do it. Ma Zhongqing and Chess Saint Baiyu are best friends, and the two of them often play chess together. Baiyu once said that if the two of them were to play seriously, the outcome would be uncertain. The person who stood out at the right time was the Deputy Prime Minister of the Imperial Censor. The officials in the court had heard of his chess skills and couldn't help but feel hopeful. In that case, let me fight for the poetry contest. A scholar from the Directorate of Literature stood out. I also want to debate with the Master of Literature. I hope your Majesty will allow me to do so. The speaker was a scholar from the Hongwen school. After these three people stood out, the officials didn't fight for them. After all, Deputy Prime Minister Ma Zhongqing was good at chess, Wei Sai was good at poetry, and Scholar Zhou had studied at the Hongwen school all his life. Among the officials, no one was more suitable than them for the last two contests. Among the crowd, Governor Dong Wenyun frowned. Wei Sai was indeed good at poetry. When he was young, he was known as the #1 scholar in the capital because of his poems. However, he was not as famous as the poet. Even the poet was not as famous as the poet. How could Wei Sai win against the outstanding talent of the Qi kingdom? When it came to poetry, the first person that came to his mind was, of course, that person. He was known as the #1 scholar of the Jing kingdom. All of his poems were widely spread. If he could handle the poetry contest, it would be more stable. However, Dong Wenyun wanted to mention that name, but Wei Sai had already stood out. It was not appropriate for him to say it again. Moreover, that name was a sensitive topic in the court. He could only shake his head helplessly and suppress his thoughts. In that case, the literary contest will be fought by Minister Ma, Minister Wei, and Minister Zhou. Emperor Jing's expression softened as he announced in front of the crowd. When the court was dismissed, the officials walked out one after another. However, their footsteps were not relaxed. Although the emperor had already decided on the candidates, they still didn't have much of a chance of winning. The master of literature, the best poet in 1,000 years, the chess soul of the Daki kingdom. Any of these titles was enough to crush people to death. Who would dare to say that they would win? The shameless envoys of the Qi kingdom had almost brought their trump cards. The hope of the literary contest was slim. It seemed that they could only pin their hopes on the martial contest. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The imperial palace will be especially lively tomorrow. Are you really not going to take a look? Li Xian stood in front of Li Yi and said temptingly, "I'm not going." Li Yi said without hesitation. He found that two bow ties looked more comfortable. It was just that the tailor's craftsmanship was too poor. When Fang went to the Jade Courtyard today, he had to ask him to find a reliable tailor. "You don't have to worry about being grounded. Uncle Huang has no time to care about us. I guarantee that the censors won't care either." Li Xian was looking forward to the bustling scene tomorrow and continued to tempt him. Li Yi seemed to be moved. He finally looked up at him and waved the thing in his hand in front of him. He asked, "Do you think one bow tie is better or two?" Chapter 461. The capital was rather quiet that day. Even the hawkers on the streets were much quieter than usual. Every now and then, people would look up in the direction of the palace, thinking about the match that was going on there. The match against the people of the Qi kingdom was a battle of honor. As citizens of the Jing kingdom, driven by their national pride and national honor, everyone was very concerned about this matter. Some underground gambling dens even opened bets for this match. In the bustling gambling dens, countless people raised their heads in anticipation, waiting for the news to spread from the palace. In the Viscount's residence, Li Yi woke up early. He had to supervise the two tailors to work quickly. In 2 days, when the boring match against the people of the Qi kingdom was over, his period of confinement would come to an end. He had to finish these 2 items before entering the palace. At this time in the Golden Hall, 2 people sat cross-legged on both sides of a chessboard. On one side was Deputy Ma, and on the other was an old man with white hair and a face full of wrinkles. Today was the first match of the written examination, and it was of utmost importance. Even Emperor Jing could not sit firmly on the throne. He walked down from above but did not get too close, watching from afar. Apart from Emperor Jing, there were only a few people in the hall. The 2 prime ministers were among them, and there were also a few old men, all famous scholars of the dynasty. On the other side, there were also several people standing behind the old man. They were all ambassadors of the Qi kingdom, and their leader was a young man who looked to be in his early 20s. In order not to disturb the 2 people playing chess, most of the officials waited outside the hall. Countless people paced in the square, their expressions faintly anxious. Deputy Ma was in the prime of his life. It was reasonable to say that both his chess skills and physical strength were at the peak of his life. Even Chess Saint Bayu did not dare to underestimate him. Against an old man, no matter how one looked at it, he had a great advantage. However, not long ago when Chess Saint Bayu played against this old man, they thought the same. But in the end, Bayu lost all 3 matches. Today, would Deputy Ma be able to turn the tide and win the first city for the country? This was the worry of the officials and Emperor Jing, not something that Emperor Jin should be worried about. These are the pastries that Lady Mother asked the catering company to make. They're delicious. Do you want to try them? Prince Jin Li Han was holding an exquisite food box in his hand. He squatted on the steps of a shady place in the palace and said to the little girl sitting there with a smile on his face, "Thank you, Brother Jin. I'm not hungry." The little girl turned her head and looked at the direction of the palace gate. She shook her head and said, "Then I'll leave it here first. You can eat it when you're hungry." Monarch Jin put the lunchbox aside and said cautiously, "Sister Yongning, I used to bully you all the time. It's all my fault. Now I know I was wrong. If anyone dares to bully you in the future, tell me and I'll beat him up for you." After thinking for a while, he added, "If it's my brother, the king of Shu, I can't beat him, but I'll tell you." However, Princess Yongning didn't seem to hear him. She murmured, "When will my brother come?" Monarch Jin scratched his head and said, "You mean Master? Master has been grounded by father for half a month. There are still a few days left. He won't come to the palace these days." Princess Yongning looked a little disappointed. She subconsciously hugged her arms and then remembered that the sheep was gone. Monarch Jin glanced in a certain direction and scratched his head. He said, "There seems to be something interesting in the legislative hall today. Sister Shaning and the others have already gone there. Do you want to go with me?" Seeing Yongning shake her head, Monarch Jin stood up and said, "Then I'll leave first." Outside the legislative hall, the officials were still pacing in the square. Several small figures squeezed at the door and poked their heads out to look inside. Before long, another curious head appeared. Inside the hall, as the chess game progressed, Emperor Jing and the others frowned. The wrinkled face of the old man from the state of Qi was expressionless. He was very calm when he picked up a chess piece and placed it down. On the other hand, Deputy Commander Ma's complexion was pale. Beads of sweat had appeared on his forehead. He had been holding a chess piece in his hand for a long time, but he didn't place it down. A hint of defeat flashed across Prime Minister Qin's face. He was about to lose this game. Ma Zhongqing, who could stand shoulder to shoulder with the chess saint, had only lasted for 2 hours against the old man. In the end, he still couldn't avoid losing. Sometimes, a match between experts would last for several hours. For Ma Zhongqing to lose in 2 hours was enough to show the difference in chess skills between the two. If he were to lose again tomorrow, there would be no need for the written examination. "I've lost." The chess piece in Ma Zhongqing's hand didn't land in the end. His face was dejected and he seemed to have aged a little in an instant. He stood up and said in a hoarse voice. Even though he had won, the old man opposite him didn't say a word. He stood up and silently stood opposite the young man. The officials outside the hall filed in. Just by looking at Ma Zhongqing's expression, they already had a conclusion. He had lost. As expected, he had lost. It had only been 2 hours, and the old man had become so powerful. The officials' hearts were heavy. They stood around and didn't say a word. "I was lucky to win the first game. Thank you for letting me win." The young man smiled and cupped his hands at the crowd. Emperor Jing was disappointed. He waved his hand and said, "Let's end the court today. Tomorrow we will continue with the second round of the written examination." "Your Majesty, please wait." At this moment, the young man suddenly spoke. "What else do you want?" Emperor Jing looked back at the young man and asked with a frown. The young man smiled and said, "This time, I propose to compete with your kingdom only for the sake of learning from each other. I have no other intentions. I really don't want to cause trouble for your kingdom." The officials frowned when they heard this. He didn't want to cause trouble for his kingdom. Didn't the third prince mean that if the competition continued, the Jing kingdom would continue to lose and lose face? Hearing this, the officials felt more ashamed and resentful than if they had lost the competition. "Does the third prince really think that you will win?" Before Emperor Jing could speak, Prime Minister Qin snorted coldly and said. The young man smiled and said, "Winning or losing isn't important. The purpose of this competition is to exchange and learn. If we insist on determining who is superior and who is inferior, it would lose its original meaning. I believe that even everyone here doesn't want to determine a winner and a loser, right?" The young man's words made all the officials speechless. If they had won the first round, they would not have allowed the Prince of Qi to speak so much here. The problem was that they had already lost the first round. If they lost the next round, they would not only lose their face but also the face of the entire Jing kingdom. At that time, what would the commoners think? What would the other kingdoms think? The Qi kingdom had only brought a few people with them, yet they had defeated the Jing kingdom. Could it be that the Jing kingdom's imperial court was filled with a bunch of good-for-nothings? "What do you want?" At this time, it was not suitable for Emperor Jing to speak. Prime Minister Qin thought for a moment and looked at the young man and asked. The young man looked at Emperor Jing and said, "As long as your country agrees to a small condition of ours, there is no need to continue the competition. After the handover of the city, our envoy will immediately leave the Jing kingdom. What does your Majesty think?" Although he was unwilling to admit it, if the competition continued, the possibility of the Jing kingdom losing face would only be greater. Emperor Jing looked at him and asked, "What is the condition?" "It's very simple. It's just a small request." The young man smiled and said, "There are many people in the envoy group. After staying in the capital for a long time, our travel expenses have been exhausted. We only hope that your Majesty can give us some food, enough for the envoy group to return to the country." "Only food?" As soon as the young man's voice fell, not only was the expression on Emperor Jing's face startled, but the officials also showed an expression of disbelief. When it came to the face of the country, they thought that the third prince of the Qi kingdom would make some unreasonable request. As long as it was a little too much, even if His Majesty agreed, they would still strongly oppose it. But who would have thought that after spending so much effort, it was actually just a little food? For a moment, the expressions of the officials as they looked at the third prince of the Qi kingdom immediately changed subtly. It was said that the third prince of the Qi kingdom was the most capable of all the princes of the Qi kingdom and could be said to be extremely talented. Could it be that the rumors were false? Was the third prince actually the same as the king of Shu? As if not noticing the strange gazes of the officials, the young man pointed to the chessboard at the side and said, "The envoy group does not need much food. As long as your majesty sends someone to put 1 grain of rice in the first grid of the chessboard, 2 grains in the second grid, 4 grains in the third grid, and after that, each grid will have twice the amount of rice in the previous grid and so on. You only need to put the rice on the 64th grid of the chessboard." After the young man finished speaking, he looked at Emperor Jing with a smile, waiting for his reply. Emperor Jing did not reply immediately. He looked at the chessboard at the side and then at the young man. Judging from the performance of the third prince of the Qi kingdom, he was definitely not an ordinary person. This competition had been planned for a long time, so how could it end so hastily? Relying on the food on the 64th grid of the chessboard to return to the Qi kingdom, they would probably starve to death before they reached the Qi kingdom. What do you all think? Emperor Jing looked at the officials around him and asked. Many officials rejoiced in their hearts. They hadn't expected that the third prince of the Qi kingdom would be a fool. This was great news for them. Although there were some who suspected that there might be a scheme behind this, the third prince only wanted some rations. So they could just give it to him. What kind of scheme could he play with a few bags of rations? Your Majesty, since the ambassadors of the Qi kingdom are so short of food, we naturally can't refuse. We can't let the ambassadors of other countries starve. This is not appropriate. Assistant Minister Qin Bo stood up and said with a smile. Your Excellency Qin is right. If we refuse, it will seem that we are stingy. It's not easy for the third prince to come from afar. Why not satisfy his request? Things took a turn and the officials all smiled and spoke. If they could use some food to send away the troublesome people of the Qi kingdom, it was a good deal no matter how they looked at it. At that time they could say that the people of the Qi kingdom were afraid, so they asked for some food and went back to the Qi kingdom. His Majesty was kind and gave them some food. Not only did they save face, but they also saw the people of the Qi kingdom as a joke. Why not? Where are the professors of mathematics in the Imperial College? Emperor Jing pondered for a moment and suddenly asked. When Chancellor Zheng heard this, he immediately went forward and said, Your Majesty, except for Professor Han, the other professors of mathematics went to the Li County mansion to ask for mathematics. They are not in the court. The reason why this Professor Han came today was that he wanted to ask for a proper imperial edict from His Majesty. Otherwise, he would not even be able to enter the gate of the Li family. Chancellor Zheng waved his hand behind him, and immediately a middle-aged man walked over quickly. Emperor Jing was a little regretful. If he knew this, he should have called Li Yi here today. He had never let him down. With him here, why should he worry about these things? Do you know how much food they want? Emperor Jing looked at Professor Han and asked. Professor Han pondered for a moment and said, Your Majesty, it's only 64 squares. It won't be a lot. Professor Han looked at the chessboard. As a professor of mathematics, he naturally thought more than the other officials. Due to the multiplication, 64 squares were actually not a small number. However, how big was a grain of rice? 1 stone of rice was already innumerable. Even if 64 squares could not be filled, 10 stones would not be enough, and 100 stones would not be enough, right? The Jing kingdom did not lack those 100 or so meters of rice. Using this amount of rice to send off the Qi kingdom's envoy was a very good deal. It was rare for the officials to have the same opinion on this matter. Emperor Jing suppressed the only worry in his heart and said, In that case then, the third prince of the Qi kingdom still had a faint smile on his face. The expressions on the officials' faces were also quite satisfied. Everyone was happy and well. Wait a minute, the harmonious atmosphere was suddenly broken by a voice. After being stunned for a moment, everyone turned their heads and looked in the direction of the voice. Prince Jin Li Han stood at the door of the hall. When he saw so many people in the hall looking at him, he couldn't help but feel a little scared. But he still forced himself to muster up courage and interrupted Emperor Jing's words, saying, Father, you can't agree with them. In front of the envoy of the Qi kingdom and the civil and military officials, Emperor Jing's words were interrupted by Prince Jin, but he was not angry at all. Instead, his face showed a thoughtful expression. The third prince of the Qi kingdom's expression changed slightly. He looked at the little fat man standing at the door of the hall with a trace of surprise in his eyes. "Your Highness, this is the court. Don't make trouble here." The officials quickly reacted. They didn't care about their identity and spoke out to stop him. This was a great advantage. They must not let Prince Jean ruin it. Next time they might not meet such a stupid prince. Most of the officials stopped Prince Jean, but a few people's faces changed at the same time. Minister of the Ministry of Revenue Qin Huan, Minister of War Yan Bing, Chancellor of the Imperial College, and the Professor of Mathematics. No one knew better than them how many incredible things were in this fat head. "Han, come here and talk." Emperor Jing smiled and waved to Prince Jean. Seeing that his father was not angry, Prince Jean was relieved. He walked over slowly, pointed at the young man and said to Emperor Jing, "Father, don't be cheated by them. My teacher said that all the countries in the world can't fill the 64 squares of the chessboard. If we build a big warehouse to store all the food, the warehouse should be 3 feet long, 6 feet wide, and high as the sun." The third prince of the Qi kingdom's expression did not change, but he sighed in his heart. For the first time he looked at the little fat man in front of him seriously. "Yes, there are so many," the Chancellor of the Imperial College said in a trembling voice. The face of Professor Han, who had just spoken, turned pale. He only felt that his eyes were a little black. If it was only Prince Jean, he still had a glimmer of hope in his heart. But the problem was that he just said, "My teacher said." Prince Jin's teacher was none other than the mysterious Li Xianzi. He taught Prince Jean, who was a naughty child, to sweep the mathematics students of the Imperial College and make the professors of mathematics extremely ashamed. How could he talk nonsense without any basis? Chapter 462. Prince Jean, are you serious? Qin Huan, the Minister of Revenue, stepped forward and asked Li Han anxiously. "Yes, sir." Li Han casually put the blame on Li Yi. With his current mathematics level, he couldn't handle such a terrible number. A granary as high as the sun was frightening. "Professor Han, are you serious? It's only 64 squares. Are there really so many? Where are the people from the Imperial College? Come out and say something." After a moment of silence, the officials finally reacted when they saw the expressions of several important people, but they still couldn't believe what Prince Jean had just said. A granary as high as the sun was 30 feet long and 20 feet wide. Who was he bluffing? The sun was very far away from here. How did Prince Jean calculate this number? The only mathematics professor from the Imperial College in the court immediately became the focus of everyone's attention. Professor Han trembled and said, Since it's Li Xianzi's words then it should be correct. Fortunately, I brought it with me." Li Han patted his butt and took out a tattered booklet from his arms. He dipped his saliva in it and quickly flipped through it. This booklet was specially made for him. There were not only strange problems in it, but also interesting stories interspersed every few pages. For Prince Jean, who often struggled in the sea of problems, this was undoubtedly a small island for him to temporarily rest on. Therefore he still remembered the stories in the booklet. "Found it." Prince Jean finally turned to a page and presented it to Emperor Jing. "Father, look, it's here." Emperor Jing looked at the page that Prince Jean had turned to. After a moment he flicked his sleeves and said, "Since it's a competition, there should be a beginning and an end. If your country's envoys can't gather enough food for the return trip, I will give you travel expenses. Tomorrow's competition will continue as usual. Don't be late." After that, Emperor Jing walked out surrounded by several eunuchs. The officials who finally knew the truth felt their faces burn. They wanted to skin the third prince of the Qi kingdom alive. Shameful, this was a great disgrace. All the civil and military officials in the court were not as good as the 9-year-old Prince Jean. They almost made a big mistake. It was hard to imagine that if His Majesty and them agreed to the third prince's request, the ruler and ministers of the Jing kingdom would become the laughingstock of all the other countries. They naturally wouldn't take out those rations. Not to mention the fact that they didn't have that much rations. Even if they did, they couldn't possibly give it to the Qi kingdom for free. If you want rations, you can just give it to a few Tianfa heavenly kings. But if he didn't give it to Prince Jean as the king of a country, how could he go back on his words? Otherwise, how could he stay in other countries in the future? It could be said that if Prince Jean was a moment late, the Jing kingdom would lose its face. The third prince of the Qi kingdom and the envoys walked out of the Golden Palace under the baptism of the gazes of the officials. There was a hint of disappointment on the face of the young man who was walking in front. If they had succeeded in what they had just done, they could have spread the news before the Jing kingdom reacted. By then they would have achieved their ultimate goal without having to compete with each other. It seems that I have underestimated the heroes of the world, the young man sighed and said in a regretful tone. One of the envoys behind him said, "So what if they find out? The result will be the same. If they lose another round tomorrow, there will be no need to compete in the written exam. As for the martial arts battle, we are not afraid at all. Why is the third prince sighing?" The young man shook his head and didn't continue this topic. He said, "Find out who the teacher of Prince Jean is." That difficult calculation problem was solved by Grand Scholar Chen. It took more than 10 accountants 3 days and 3 nights to calculate the result. I didn't expect there to be such a capable person in the Jing Kingdom who knew the secret of it. Otherwise, it's a pity. Seeing the envoy of the Qi Kingdom walk out of the Grand Palace, the anger of the officials because they were fooled by the envoys subsided a little. They had thought that the third prince of the Qi Kingdom was a fool, but they didn't expect that they were the real fools. They had almost fallen into his trap. He was so insidious and cunning at such a young age. He wouldn't live long. When he shifted his gaze to Prince Jean, his expression immediately became gentle. Very good. Like father, like son. The 9-year-old Prince Jean had seen through the conspiracy of the envoy of another kingdom in the imperial court and saved the face of his majesty and the officials. His deed was worthy of being recorded in the annals of history. The officials' joy didn't last long. They realized a serious problem. Though the conspiracy of the envoy of the Qi Kingdom had been exposed by Prince Jean, they had already lost the first round of the written examination today. If they lost again tomorrow, there would be no need to compete in the third round. Therefore the match tomorrow was very important. They couldn't afford to lose. Otherwise they would lose face sooner or later. The Imperial Academy guard's size face darkened. It was his turn to compete tomorrow. In fact, he wasn't sure whether he could win or not. The greatest poet in 1,000 years. This name alone was a bit frightening. Because of the announcement of the envoy of the Qi Kingdom, the populace in the capital had already received the news before the officials left the palace. They had lost. They had lost to the Qi Kingdom in the first round of the written examination. In the gambling house, countless people were cursing at Ma Zhongqing. This defeat was not a big deal, but many of them would have to bear a huge loss. Many of them would go bankrupt. Who would have thought that the countless capable people in the capital would lose to a nameless old man from the Qi Kingdom at their own doorstep? How ironic was this? The enthusiasm of the common people was greatly dampened, and the entire capital was filled with a gloomy atmosphere. Quite a few people blamed this failure on Ma Zhongqing. Rumors spread everywhere, directly labeling Ma Zhongqing as a sinner of the country. No one knew how many rotten eggs and vegetables were thrown over the wall into the Ma Manor. The dignified deputy imperial censor was hit in the forehead by a stone thrown by a naughty child on his way home. After hearing the rumors, he fainted on the spot. Not only that, the populace also had a lot of complaints about the current emperor. Although they weren't as blatant as they were against Ma Zhongqing, they were secretly criticizing His Majesty the Emperor. As Li Yi listened to Li Xian, he reminded the two tailors of the details that they needed to pay attention to. I heard that the third prince of the Qi Kingdom had set up a trap for the emperor and the officials in the court. If it weren't for Prince Jin's reminder, we would have lost a lot of face this time. Li Xian's face was full of resentment. If we lose another round tomorrow, we'll lose completely to the Qi Kingdom in the written examination. After listening to Li Xian's narration a few times, Li Yi had a general understanding of the so-called contest. It was nothing more than a few high-level players who had played the game to the highest level, pretending to be newbies to bully a group of newbies. Of course, those who could represent the Jing Kingdom were not newbies, but it was obvious that there was still a long way to go before they could reach the highest level. The Qi Kingdom seemed to be more powerful than the Jing Kingdom in terms of economy, culture, and military. It was impossible for the Qi Kingdom to win this contest unless someone had cheated. Poor Deputy Imperial Censor Ma, Li Yi sighed. As a dignified Deputy Imperial Censor, what he cared about the most was his own reputation. This time he was directly called a sinner of the country. It was hard to say if he could get over this hurdle. Judging from the situation, Wei Sai and Grand Scholar Zhou were in danger. Fortunately, the old emperor didn't remember him. Otherwise he would be scolded to death by those ignorant onlookers. Summon County Magistrate Li to the palace tomorrow morning. As Li Yi was thinking of this, the Jing Emperor said this while waving his hand in the Hall of Diligent Government while holding a book of poems titled, The Collection of Bright Moon, in his hand. Chapter 463. Tomorrow's contest is very important. No matter what, I plan to go to the palace to have a look. Li Xian's expression was firm. As a member of the Li royal family, He naturally valued this contest more than ordinary people. After saying that, he turned back to look at Li Yi and said, "Aren't you quite good at writing poems? Can you beat that Millennium Poetry genius? That nickname sounds scary, but I don't know if he's really that good." "Of course," Li Yi said casually. Then he turned to a tailor and said, "Just follow that painting. Don't change anything." So what if he was the best poet in 1,000 years? Fame was not something to brag about. Moreover, the development of poetry in this world had long been led into the gutter by someone. If the former Tang dynasty followed the established historical development, Li Bai Du Fu Wang Wei Bai Ji, any one of these people would be added with the word 10,000 years in front of their titles. King Zhong, the poetry demon, was said to be good at fusing words and galloping at the imagination. That was why he was called the poetry demon. Fortunately, Li Yi's coffin was suppressed. Otherwise, the real poetry demon would jump out and beat people up. They were the true gods of poetry. In terms of poetry, they belonged to another plane of existence compared to this world. Standing on the shoulders of so many great people, how could they not be able to kill a scholar from the Qi kingdom? If he lost, the coffins of those great writers would really be broken. That's true. Li Xian shook his head. Although he did not know much about poetry, he knew that Li Yi was very famous in Qing'an Prefecture. However, even King Zhong, the poetry demon, admitted that he was not as good as that young man from the Qi kingdom. Li Yi definitely could not do it. He had indeed asked a superfluous question. "Lord Zhu, do you think this will work?" The two tailors wiped the sweat from their foreheads and looked carefully at this strange Lord Zhu. They had never seen such a huge doll before. Not only did it have a strange shape, it also had a lot of requests. Furthermore, when they were working, this Lord Zhu was watching them and reminding them 10 times every 2 hours. No tailor could stand it. Okay, it's not bad." Li Yi waved his hand and said, "Go to Butler Li to receive your reward." The two tailors felt as if they had been pardoned and their faces were filled with joy. This lord was not good at all, but his temperament of rewarding without a word was very popular. The two tailors thanked him for a while and immediately went to find Butler Li. Li Xian looked at the two strange things in front of him. He didn't know what was so special about the things that Li Yi had been busy with for the past few days. "Son-in-law, the people from the Imperial College have come again." Fang leaned against the door and said, "They brought gifts this time and they are quite heavy. I asked the gatekeeper to send a few cups of tea over, and they are still waiting outside." Li Xian asked in confusion, "Why are the people from the Imperial College looking for you? Go out and have a look." The people from the Imperial College had visited the Viscount's mansion more than 3 times, and the gifts were heavier each time. They also let the people stand outside the door and bask in the sun. It was really unreasonable. At the very least, they should see each other before basking in the sun. "Xing Darren, do we really have to wait like this?" Outside the Viscount's mansion, a doctor of mathematics looked at the Chancellor and asked with a bitter face. The rest of the people also looked at him. This was not a slow treatment. They had been visiting for several days and they had given countless gifts. But today they could only drink a cup of tea. They didn't even get to enter the door. No one would feel good in their heart. "Wait." The Chancellor gritted his teeth. Today, Prince Jin's performance in the court finally made him clearly aware of the difference between the Imperial College and Li Xianzi. Now that His Majesty has realized the importance of the new mathematics, it was okay for the Imperial College to make a mistake once or twice, but if they were to be slapped in the face by Prince Jin a few more times, they would lose face. If the Imperial College was abolished, the Chancellor would definitely surpass his predecessors and leave his name in history. Just when everyone was waiting anxiously, a few figures finally appeared at the entrance of the Viscount's mansion. "My apologies for the long wait. His Majesty's confinement period hasn't ended yet, so he can't leave the residence. If you have anything to say, please come in and talk." Li Yi stood at the door and said to the people from the Directorate. Li Yi was very clear about how many times these people from the Imperial College had snitched on him. Naturally, he would not treat them as distinguished guests, so he spoke in an indifferent tone. The Chancellor was not surprised by Li Yi's attitude at all. He stepped forward and said with a smile, "Under His Majesty's order, I brought the Doctor of Mathematics from the Imperial College to learn the new mathematics from Li Xianzi. For the sake of, since it is His Majesty's order, you can listen to it in the Bowen Hall from now on." Li Yi thought for a moment and said, how free was he to waste time teaching these people? Mathematics was a road of no return. There was only a starting point and no end. When the time came, he could just throw some unreasonable equations and mingle with calculus, and it would be enough for them to study until they retired. "Thank you, Li Xianzi." "So be it." At least he would feel more at ease. The Chancellor of Kingdom didn't think that county magistrately would put aside his prejudice against them and teach them seriously. He didn't stay any longer. After expressing his gratitude, he left with the Directorate of Kingdom. Li Yi had already heard about Prince Jin Li Han's matter. This kid didn't let me worry about him during the holidays. He made so many things. It must be because he left too little homework. It seemed that it was time to write another booklet. Early in the morning, the sky had just brightened. Li Yi rubbed his sleepy eyes and looked at the two eunuchs standing in the yard. He turned around and walked into the house. Oh, the confinement period is not over yet. I'm going back to sleep for a while. Don't wake me up if there's nothing important, and don't wake me up if there's something. Anyone who was woken up before dawn would not be in a good mood. Li Yi yawned a few times and crossed the threshold. His Majesty knew that you would be lazy, so he specially sent this old man here. A gloomy voice came from behind. Changde grabbed his collar and pulled him back. He said, Li Xianzi, you'd better come with this old man. He nodded slightly to Rui, who was standing on the side, and then dragged Li Yi out of the door. It turned out to be Changde, this old guy. This old guy was quite strong. It seemed that he couldn't sleep in today. When he was dragged away by the old guy, he told Rui to remember to leave some food for him in the morning. The next moment he was pushed into the carriage. Wait a minute. Seeing the old guy turned over and got on the horse as if he was going to leave immediately, Li Yi quickly said. Changde looked back and said, Is there anything else? If His Majesty's important matter is delayed, you and I can't afford to bear the consequences. I'm going back to get something. Li Yi jumped off the carriage and entered the Viscount's mansion. After a while he came out with two things in his arms. Changde glanced at him and gently waved his whip. The carriage started moving. Chief Chong? The carriage had not entered the city yet, and it was too bumpy to sleep. Li was a little bored. He opened the window and looked at Changde. Speak. Changde said without turning his head. A trace of curiosity appeared on Li Yi's face. Can I ask you a question? This old man has never practiced the Sunflower Treasure Book. Not that. Li Yi looked at him and asked, Why don't you call yourself, this old man? Changde raised his eyebrows. Why should this old man call himself, this old man? Bastard scriptwriter. Li Yi rolled down the window, leaned on the sheep doll, murmured and closed his eyes. Chapter 464. After the carriage entered the bluestone streets of the capital, it gradually steadied. Changde waved at the guards at the palace gate, and the carriage went straight into the palace. The happiest thing in the morning was to have a good sleep after waking up. Although sleeping in the carriage was not as comfortable as sleeping on a bed, it was good to have something soft to lean on. Li Yi only woke up when the carriage suddenly stopped and his head bumped into the carriage. He must have seen too many beautiful goats recently. He actually dreamed that he was catching goats on a green grassland. If Changde did not suddenly stop, he would still be fighting with Pleasant Goat in his dream. County magistrately, it's time to get off. An uncomfortable voice came from outside. Li Yi unwillingly got off the carriage. He looked around and suddenly exclaimed, Why are we here? His Majesty and a few important officials are at the Hall of Diligent Government. County magistrately, quickly follow me. Changde's voice was always so annoying. No, I have to go back for a while. Li Yi shook his head and said. Changde frowned and asked, Where? Li Yi pointed and said, The palace in front. Changde glanced at the direction and said, County magistrately, if you want to see Princess Yongning, wait until you see His Majesty first. No, I don't have the time later. Li Yi sat back on the carriage. Changde smiled sinisterly, Then don't blame me. With that he strode towards Li Yi. What do you want? I'm telling you, don't touch me. Let me give you a piece of advice. Don't provoke me. I'm even afraid of myself when I'm angry. My head hurts. Don't tell me my hysteria is acting up again. The smile on Changde's face froze. The 6-year-old girl sat on the stone steps in the shade outside the palace and looked in the direction of the palace gate. Although she had been doing this for a year, she was completely different from before. The stupidity on her face was gone, and her eyes were full of intelligence. When there was a meaning to waiting, everything suddenly became clear. A few eunuchs and palace maids were standing in the distance. When they saw the little princess smile from time to time, they looked excited. Li Xianzi was really a man of God. He cured the little princess's strange disease that even the imperial doctors couldn't do anything about. They were happy to see the little princesses change these days. It was a pity that Li Xianzi was grounded by His Majesty because he beat the King of Shu. Otherwise, the little princess would definitely smile more. Yongning looked in that direction again, thinking that her brother would not be coming today. She turned around and saw 2 goat horns tied with a bow, as well as the first thing she saw in this world that she was familiar with in her memory. Li Yi saw the surprise in her eyes. He pushed the doll that was as tall as Yongning over and asked with a smile, "Do you like it?" After the little girl came back to her senses, she suddenly pounced forward. However, she did not pounce on the beautiful sheep doll that Li Yi had carefully prepared for her, but Li Yi himself. Looking at the little figure hugging him tightly, Li Yi was stunned for a moment. Then he lovingly caressed her head. Changde stood behind them, and a trace of doubt appeared on his old face. What he couldn't understand the most was that Princess Yongning was so intimate with Li Yi, even more than His Majesty. Was it because Li Xianzi cured her disease? After this thought came to his mind, he faintly felt that things were not so simple. Humph. When Yongning let go of him and finally focused her attention on the beautiful sheep doll, a cold snort suddenly came from behind Li Yi. The sound was familiar and so was the scene. Li Yi turned around and saw the proud Lolita standing there with her hands on her hips like a tigress, looking at him with extremely fierce eyes. One should not fall at the same place twice. When Li Yi turned around and dragged out another doll that was almost the same as the previous one from the carriage, but it was bigger than the previous one, and about the same height as Princess Shining, the proud Lolita screamed and pounced on it. Regardless of ancient times or modern times, plush toys, especially large plush toys, had an unparalleled attraction for girls. This was because such large toys could bring them a great sense of security. Of course, the premise was that the girl was really a girl and still retained a young girl's heart. Tomboys and girls' mothers had already broken away from this low-level sense of security and were generally excluded. "Thank you, sir." Princess Shining, who finally recovered from her excitement, immediately pounced on Li Yi. She jumped up and hung on him like a koala and kissed his face. Only then did she realize that the person in front of her was Sir and not her mother. Her little face turned red and she ran away with her beautiful sheep doll. Ahem. When Li Yi squatted down and whispered to Yongning, Changde finally could not help coughing twice. Li Yi turned around, looked at him and said with concern, "Chief Chang, if you are not feeling well, you should go back and rest. Don't worry about me." The chief chamberlain's eyelids twitched, and he forcibly suppressed the surging genuine qi in his body. He said in a low voice, "Li Xianzi, have you forgotten something?" "What is it?" Li Yi looked puzzled. Crack. The green bricks under Changde's feet were broken. There was still an hour before the second competition with the Qi Kingdom officially began. Hall of Diligent Government. Emperor Jing was high up, and there were more than 10 figures in the hall, including the left and right ministers, the 6 ministers, the capital governor Dong Wenyun, Li Xian, and Emingzu were also in the crowd. "Subject Wei, do you think you can win today?" Emperor Jing looked at Wei Sai and asked directly. Wei Sai showed a bitter expression and said, "I will do my best." Even Li Xian could tell that Wei Sai was not confident, let alone the old foxes in the court who were good at reading people's expressions. Although he said he would do his best, Wei Sai obviously did not have the confidence to win today's competition. However, to the emperor and the ministers of the Jing Kingdom, they did not want Wei Sai to do his best. They wanted to win and they had to win. Wei Sai should know the significance of this competition for us. Prime Minister Qin suddenly said and looked at him, "I only have one question, what are your chances of winning?" Wei Sai thought for a long time and then said with difficulty, 30%. The hearts of the people in the hall also sank when they heard Wei Sai's words. 30% was not a number they expected, after all they wanted 100%. However, after the poetry demon Wang Zhong admitted defeat, Wei Sai was their most capable person. If even Wei Sai only had a 30% chance of winning, the others might not even have a 10% chance of winning. As for the so-called scholars of the younger generation in the capital, in their eyes, the poems of those people were just children's tricks, and should not be taken seriously. "That person is not even 30 years old, is he really that good?" Emperor Jing asked with a frown. The old man next to Prime Minister Qin stepped forward and said, "Your Majesty, Zhao Xiuwen is very famous in the Qi Kingdom, and he is known as the first poet in 1,000 years. Although this is exaggerated, it is enough to show his talent, and talent in the way of poetry is often more important than hard work." Hearing Prime Minister Qin's words, the dozen or so officials in the court felt very depressed. Why did they have to meet such a rare freak of 1,000 years? Why did the Jing Kingdom not have such a freak? Dong Wenyun's lips moved. He wanted to say that everyone, including His Majesty, had neglected one person. As the former magistrate of Qing, and he knew the boy's talent. Did they really think that Su Xuezheng's evaluation of him as the first scholar of the Jing kingdom was a joke? However, Wei Sai was still there, and in front of so many officials, it was not good for him to say these words. Emperor Jing sighed helplessly and said, "Could it be that in this big capital, there is really no one who can beat that Zhao? Your Majesty, Li Xianzi has arrived and he is waiting with Princess Yongning outside the hall." Just as Emperor Jing's voice fell, Changde walked in from outside and said loudly. Chapter 465. Seeing Li Yi holding Yongning's hand and walking in from outside, Emperor Jing was a little depressed. His daughter was even more intimate to an outsider than herself. For a father, this was not something to be happy about. However, thinking that if it wasn't for Li Yi, her soullessness would not be cured. He was afraid that he would not be able to hear her call him Imperial Father. Until he died, he felt much better. "Yongning, come to Imperial Father." Emperor Jing waved to Yongning with a pleasant face. The little girl looked up at Li Yi and then walked up with small steps. Li Xian leaned over and whispered, "Didn't you say that you were not interested in these things? Why are you here again?" Li Yi glanced up and did not speak. If it wasn't for the person above, he would still be busy catching sheep on the green grassland. How would he have time to care about these things? Li Xian did not have a chance to say a second sentence to Li Yi. Dong Wenyun walked over and whispered, "This time I recommended you to His Majesty. Tell me the truth. What do you think of Zhao Xiuwen of the Qi Kingdom compared to you?" Only then did Li Yi know why he was suddenly summoned to the palace during his confinement. It turned out that he was betrayed by this guy. After all, they came from the same place. Wouldn't his conscience hurt if he betrayed his hometown? Li Yi did not answer Dong Wenyun because after Emperor Jing let Princess Yongning sit down next to him, he directly asked Li Yi, "This is urgent. I will not say more. I just want to ask you one thing. If I let you participate in today's competition, what are your chances of winning?" Hearing Emperor Jing's words, Wei Sai raised his head. Prime Minister Qin also seemed to think of something. Dong Wenyun's eyes turned slightly. The rest of the people's faces were a little stunned. Was His Majesty going to let this Li Xianzi participate in the second competition? This poem, I actually only know a little about it. Li Yi was taken aback when he heard that. He said slowly, "Moreover, writing poems and lyrics depends on the state and mood of the moment. There's no such thing as confidence. Young Li is right." Old General Shui, who had been dozing off while leaning against the pillar, finally opened his eyes. He waved his hand and said, "Isn't it just 2 poems? What's there to compare? I just feel that whatever best poet wrote was bullsh**. Who dares to object?" Li Yi deeply agreed with this. As expected of old General Shui, this was the domineering attitude that a large country should have. No matter how good Zhao Xiuwen's poems were, this was the Jing kingdom. This was their territory. If anyone dared to say that Wei Sai's poems were not as good as Zhao Xiuwen's, they could just drag him out and bury him. Wouldn't everyone's opinion be the same? What was the point of making things so troublesome? Qin Xiang frowned as if he was too lazy to discuss this matter with old General Shui, so he simply kept his mouth shut. All the civil officials had bitter smiles on their faces. Since ancient times there was no first in literature. Everyone had their preferences. Old General Shui's words seemed reasonable, but did he think that all the civil and military officials in the imperial court, including the emperor, were as shameless as him? General Shui's words are wrong. If it were true, then wouldn't our Jing kingdom become the laughingstock of all the other countries? The Minister of Rights, an old man with white hair, said with a frown. "Let's see who dares to laugh." Old General Shui glared and the Minister of Rights swallowed back his words. Jing Di patted Yongning's head. Seeing the atmosphere in the hall become chaotic again, he rubbed his chest and felt suffocated again. In the end, he did not sleep enough in the morning. Li Yi yawned and prepared to take advantage of their discussion to close his eyes and take a nap. Suddenly he felt someone tugging on his sleeve. Emingzu walked to his side and looked at him. She said, "We cannot lose today. Be more serious, I know you have a way. Keep a low profile, keep a low profile." Li Yi stretched out his hand and gestured for her to lower her voice. Old General Shui's way was the best way. Fists were the hard way. If they were not convinced, they could fight. If the Qi kingdom was really powerful, they could eat a few divine punishment pills first. When you beat up the king of Shu, did you think about keeping a low profile? Emingzu glanced at him and said, I thought about it," Li Yi said hesitantly. If he had not thought about keeping a low profile at that time, the officials would not have seen county magistrately beating up the king of Shu, but county magistrately killing the king of Shu. County Magistrate of Chang, and Li Yi, follow me. Jing Di suddenly stood up and pointed at Li Yi. After he finished speaking, he walked towards the back of the palace. Li Yi was startled for a moment. He looked at Li Xian and then at Li Mingzhu. Seeing that they were also puzzled, he could only follow them in confusion. Behind the Hall of Diligent Government was the garden that Li Yi often visited. When Li Yi followed Changde to the garden, he saw Jing Di standing in the stone pavilion in the garden. Is there really no chance of winning? Jing Di looked back at him and asked. It's difficult. Li Yi sighed and said. Jing Di's face showed a trace of thinking, and then he said, I heard from Xian'er that you want to take Yong Ning out of the palace? Although he did not know why the old emperor suddenly mentioned this, Li Yi's eyes lit up and he said, Yes, the atmosphere in the palace is too depressing, and it is not suitable for Princess Yong Ning's treatment. If her soullessness relapses, even I can do nothing. Yong Ning is a princess of a country. Her status is so noble. How can she easily leave the palace? Jing Di shook his head and said, Even if I agree, the officials in the court will not agree, nor will the censors. A trace of helplessness appeared on Li Yi's face. Of course he knew this. It was not so easy for a young prince to leave the palace. If something happened to him, it would cause a huge shock in the entire capital. Yong Ning was too young now. No one, from the emperor to the court officials, would agree to her leaving the palace. He was just thinking about it. If you win this competition, I will allow you to take Yong Ning out of the palace for a month, but her range of activity is limited to 10 miles around the Viscount's residence. Hearing Jing Di's words, Li Yi's expression froze. The light in his eyes soared. He suddenly raised his head and asked, Your Majesty, are you serious? How sure are you now? Jing Di did not expect that he had changed so much. After a moment of shock, he looked at him and asked with a faint smile. Li Yi's eyes flashed fiercely, Your Majesty, how do you want them to die? I am really a failure as an emperor. I have to rely on the help of the children again and again. The first 2 times it was Han-er, and this time it is Yong Ning. Jing Di's face was no longer worried and he said with a teasing smile. Your Majesty, this boy is too outrageous. Can't he take the initiative to stand up and share the burden for Your Majesty? Changde, who had always been indifferent, showed a rare trace of anger on his face. If Your Majesty did not bring out Princess Yong Ning this time, I don't know how long he would hide. Isn't the result the same? Jing Di smiled and said disapprovingly. Chapter 466. What did my father say to you just now? When they came out of the Hall of Diligent Government, they saw Li Yi holding Yong Ning's hand and humming a light and nameless tune. It was obvious that he was in a good mood. So, Mingzhu walked up to him and asked, You will know when we go to the Hall of Political Integrity. Li Yi replied casually and whispered something in Yong Ning's ear. The little girl's eyes instantly lit up. Li Mingzhu's expression changed slightly. She instantly understood what he was referring to, and her heart that was hanging in the air finally relaxed. Li Xian's expression was also slightly excited. He immediately looked forward to the competition. This is a serious matter. Your Majesty, please reconsider. County Li is indeed talented in mathematics. But today's competition can't be treated as a child's play. Your Majesty, please take back your order. We can't lose again. Hearing the news just announced by Emperor Jing, several high-ranking officials in the imperial court changed their expressions and stepped forward to persuade him. They had long been accustomed to Li Yi's ability to surprise him at the critical moment. How could they not know that Li Yi was 100% confident when they saw his expression just now? At this moment, they didn't bother to explain to the officials. They waved their hands and said, I have made up my mind. You don't need to say more. It's almost time. Follow me to the Hall of Political Integrity. Your Majesty. Several officials still wanted to say something, but Emperor Jing had already walked out of the hall. Your Majesty, you are too hasty. Could it be that County Li's attainments in poetry are higher than Wei Sai's? I'm afraid that he will lose today. The Minister of the Ministry of Rights said with a worried expression. A trace of despair even appeared on the faces of the officials behind him. How could a young man in his 20s compare with Wei Sai, who had studied poetry for decades? His Majesty's momentary play would make the Jing kingdom pay a heavy price. Wei Sai, on the other hand, didn't show any disappointment or anger. Instead, he seemed relieved. After all, in a situation where he would lose more than he would win, he would also have a lot of psychological pressure. Of course, it would be good if he won, but if he lost, Ma Zhongqing would be an example to him. He would be reviled by the people of the capital and even the entire Jing kingdom. Just the thought of it was frightening. If it was not necessary, who would be willing to bet their reputation on this match? That Li Xianzi was still too young, and youthful vigor often came at a great price. It was rare that Prime Minister Qin didn't express any opinion on this matter. Among the people present, even Dong Wenyun didn't know county magistrate Li better than him. If even Wei Sai did not have the confidence to win, then His Majesty's decision was probably the most correct one. The Hall of Legislative Affairs was where all the officials attended the morning court. However, from yesterday onwards, the morning court session was no longer the most important activity of the Hall of Legislative Affairs. There was nothing more important than winning the contest against the Qi Kingdom. More than 10 core officials and Emperor Jing were discussing important matters in the Hall of Legislative Affairs, while the others were waiting outside the Hall of Legislative Affairs. When Li Yi and the others arrived, there were already many people outside the hall. It was not time yet, so the doors of the hall were not opened. When the three of them walked to a secluded corner with few people, Li Xian, who had been talking to Emingzu in a low voice, suddenly froze. Then he walked to the side with a happy expression, patted a young man's shoulder and said in surprise, "Brother, we meet again." The young man turned his head and looked a little surprised. When he saw Li Xian, he showed a puzzled expression. Soon he understood and said, "You are the one from the Jadeite courtyard." Li Yi and Emingzu walked over. When he saw the young man, he was also a little surprised. Last time in the Jadeite courtyard, because there were no seats, Li Xian took the initiative to share a table with him. Although they didn't talk much, Li Yi had a good impression of him. It was indeed surprising to meet him in the imperial palace this time. "Why are you here?" Li Xian looked at him and asked curiously, "Are you also an official of the imperial court? Why haven't I seen you before?" The young man was speechless and didn't know how to answer. Emingzu looked at Li Xian in surprise. The crowd in the distance looked over and there was also a small commotion. Li Yi looked at the young man and the people behind him. He turned his head and looked around. Seeing the expressions on the officials' faces, he thought to himself, "It can't be such a coincidence, can it? The third prince of the Qi Kingdom?" Li Yi looked at him and asked uncertainly. At this special time, he was excluded by the officials of the Jing Kingdom. These people clearly saw him as their leader. Other than the famous third prince, there seemed to be no one else. "Brotherly, we meet again." The young man smiled and cupped his hands in salute to them. Li Xian was stunned and didn't recover from the surprise for a moment. Li Yi saluted the young man and pulled on Li Xian's sleeve, pulling him to another place. This was not a suitable occasion to get close to the young man. "The person with them seems to be the eldest princess of the Jing Kingdom. Do you know them, third prince?" After Li Yi and the other two left, an old man came up and asked. The young man smiled and said, "I've met them once. They are two interesting people." He didn't continue on this topic and asked, "The second round of the competition is about to begin. Brother Xiuwen, are you ready?" The other young man leaned against a pillar and was engrossed in a book. He didn't answer. The third prince of the Qi Kingdom shook his head. The poetry addict was indeed a poetry addict. On the other side, Emingzu looked at Li Yi and Li Xian suspiciously. Before she could ask the question in her heart, there was a sudden commotion. Not far away, Jing Di, accompanied by Xiang Qin and the others, slowly walked over. The officials looked excited and followed Jing Di into the main hall. The third prince of the Qi Kingdom looked at the young man behind him and said, "Let's go." The young man stood up and closed the book in his hand. He looked in the direction of the main hall and smiled. "I hope today's competition will be interesting." The court was strangely quiet. It wasn't because they were worried that the noise would affect the competition, but because of the decision His Majesty had just announced. The candidate for this competition was not Wei Sai, but Li Xianzi. His Majesty's actions had undoubtedly killed off their last glimmer of hope before the competition even began. If the envoy of the Qi Kingdom was not in the hall, the Golden Hall would have been in chaos. The crowd looked at Li Yi with confusion, pity, and even resentment. But no matter what kind of emotion they had no hope for the result of today's competition. Li Xianzi? An imperceptible light flashed in the eyes of the third prince of the Qi Kingdom, but it quickly disappeared. As for the young man, he looked slightly regretful. He waited for the third prince to draw a stick from a bamboo tube. When he saw the word dusk on it, he closed his eyes and pondered. Naturally, this poetry competition would not be free to express themselves. There were dozens of sticks in the bamboo tube with different contents written on them, such as expressing one's feelings and expressing one's feelings. Whichever one was drawn, the two would use it as the topic and compose a poem respectively. Comparing similar poems, it would naturally be easier to distinguish who was better. Of course, everyone had their own style of poetry. In order to eliminate chance and ensure fairness, 3 lots would be drawn for this competition. The moment the young man closed his eyes, Li Yi had already walked to the table and dipped his brush in ink. Under the shocked expressions of the officials and the envoy of the Qi kingdom, he wrote decisively. So fast. Could it be that he was prepared? That's not possible. The stick was drawn by the 3rd prince of the Qi kingdom. Before this no one knew the topic unless, cough cough. Lord Zhu, be careful with your words. The officials seemed to have thought of something in their shock. Their expressions became strange. They looked at each other and then returned to normal. When the envoy of the Qi kingdom saw this, he naturally thought of something. The expression on his face became somewhat uncertain. Only the 3rd prince's expression was indifferent. When he had drawn the lots, he had already checked them carefully. Every single lot had a different content written on it. Unless he had prepared dozens of excellent poems that could surpass Zhao Xiuwen's within a day, but that was simply impossible. At this time he did not care about the poems. He was thinking about something else. His gaze on Li Yi became deeper. After a while, Li Yi put down his brush. Immediately, a eunuch came forward and posted the poem he had written on the paper. At this time, Zhao Xiuwen of the Qi kingdom had not opened his eyes. The officials naturally looked over at him. They were first shocked by the elegant semi-cursive script. It was said that the county magistrate of Chang and had great attainments in calligraphy at such a young age. At this moment they realized that the rumors were true. It must be said that at this moment, a glimmer of hope was ignited in the hearts of the officials. Then, when they read the poem, their hope was mercilessly extinguished again. It's not easy to reach such a level in such a short time. It's also an excellent piece of work. But it's a pity? Among the hundreds of officials in the imperial court, aside from the military generals, those who could be called civil officials were all outstanding individuals. Even if they weren't like Wei Sai, who had spent his entire life studying poetry, how could they not have profound attainments in poetry? Not to mention that they had prepared in advance. If they had really improvised on the spot, it was rare to be able to write such a poem in such a short time. At least, most of them could not do it. But the person in front of him had the title of the best poet in a millennium. If it was only to this extent, it was impossible for him to beat him. Looking at the official's size, Jing Emperor's expression did not change. After glancing at Li Yi, he found that he was talking to Yong Ning in a low voice. He felt more at ease. At this moment, Zhao Xiuwen finally opened his eyes. He walked to his table, picked up his brush and dipped it in ink. The officials' hearts also twisted. He looked up at the poem that had been posted. His eyes lit up because of the handwriting. Then he shook his head and lowered his head to write. After a moment, Zhao Xiuwen looked up again. This time, the brush in his hand could no longer fall. Chapter 467. What's going on? Why isn't he moving? Maybe he hasn't thought it through? After seeing the poem written by Li Yi in such a short time, the officials felt hopeless. Seeing Zhao Xiuwen staring at the poem for a long time, they were confused. This was not a difficult topic. If Li Xianzi couldn't think of a line of the poem after he finished writing, the officials would doubt whether the title of the best poet in 1,000 years was just an empty title. But if that was the case, why would Wang Zhong, the poetry demon, say that he was ashamed of his inferiority? Is there something wrong with Li Xianzi's poem? Someone asked confusedly, noticing that Zhao Xiuwen's eyes were fixed on Li Yi's poem. How can this be? Wei Sai stood in the crowd, his face full of disbelief. Like Zhao Xiuwen, he stared at the poem and murmured, "How can this be? How can this be?" A scholar from the Hongwen school walked out and stroked his beard. He had a slightly excited expression on his face. What an eye-opener. It really is an eye-opener. The officials were very surprised to hear this. This poem could not be said to be ordinary, but it was not outstanding either. But looking at the expressions of Wei Sai and Grand Scholar Chu, it seemed that there was something special about it. So the officials looked at the poem again, left and right, horizontally and vertically, but still couldn't figure it out. The expressions of the people changed. Could it be that Wei Sai, Grand Secretary Chu, and Li Xianzi's attainments in poetry had reached an unfathomable level that they couldn't even understand? At this time, Zhao Xiuwen finally looked away. He put down his brush and walked back to the side of the 3rd prince of the Qi kingdom. He said calmly, "I lost the first round." Hearing this, a eunuch immediately extinguished a long stick of incense. Of course, there was no time limit for this competition. Otherwise, the emperor and the officials wouldn't be able to wait for half a month to compose a poem. From the time they decided on the topic to the time they finished writing the 3 poems, it took them half an hour. Li Xianzi didn't think at all and started writing, so he didn't waste much time. On the other hand, Zhao Xiuwen's incense had been burning for a short while. What? Why? You clearly haven't written it yet. Hearing Zhao Xiuwen's words, the expressions of the envoys of the Qi kingdom changed drastically. After the young man from the Jing kingdom had composed that poem, they had thought that victory was in their grasp. Who would have thought that such a thing would happen? Zhao Xiuwen actually admitted defeat? In an instant, the few envoys looked at him with vigilance. Could it be that this person with the surname Zhao had been bribed by Jinghua? Or could it be that he was Jinghua's spy? In this round, the envoy of the Qi kingdom had lost in a baffling manner. The officials of the Jing kingdom had also won in a daze. He won just like that? What? Even they had come up with a poem that could surpass Li Xianzi's. Although it took them a little longer to come up with a poem that could surpass Li Xianzi's, it didn't matter if they won another round. Why did this man from the Qi kingdom admit defeat? Was his poem really just a boast? Don't waste too much time in the first round. You did well. The third prince of the Qi kingdom finally withdrew his gaze and patted Zhao Xiuwen's shoulder as he spoke. Zhao Xiuwen nodded. When he looked at the figure chatting and laughing with the young girl again, his expression finally became serious. First round, Li Xianzi wins. The Qi kingdom admitted defeat, so they didn't even need to judge this round. The eunuch immediately announced the result in a loud voice. Even when they heard the news that they had won, the officials still didn't understand why they had won. Wei Sai, what's going on? Yes, great scholar Chu. What's so special about this poem? Why don't you tell us? Though they had won, the officials felt even more tormented. Wei Sai and great scholar Chu immediately became the focus of attention. Great scholar Chu stroked his beard again and said with a smile, "My lords, please take a look at Li Xianzi's poem again." The crowd felt puzzled and looked at the poem again. The tide follows the dark waves of the snowy mountain and the distant fishing boat catches the moonlight. The bridge faces the gate of the temple and the path is small. The alley is the spring and the stone ripples are clear. The distant green trees and the river are at dawn. The rosy sunset is clear. Looking at the clouds and water in the distance, the thousands of dots on the blue peak are light. But no matter how they looked at it, this poem, writing about the cold mountain temple, didn't seem to have anything special. This poem could barely describe the scene at dusk. If they thought about it carefully, it would be suspected of going off topic. Master Chu, don't keep us guessing, an official urged. Great scholar Chu shook his head and said, "My lords, why don't you try to read this poem backwards?" Read backwards? The officials were puzzled. How could a poem be read backwards? But an official read it out reflexively. The thousands of dots on the blue peak are light. The water is the edge of the clouds and the water is the edge of the clouds and the stone ripples are clear. Hiss, this. He closed his mouth after reading one line, and his eyes seemed to pop out from his eye sockets. How can it be? How can it be done like this? This poem is actually a poem if you read it backwards. After being reminded by great scholar Chu, the officials had finally figured out the secret. The tide follows the dark waves of the snowy mountain and the distant fishing boat catches the moonlight. The bridge faces the gate of the temple and the path is small. The alley is the spring and the stone ripples are clear. The distant green trees and the river is at dawn. The rosy sunset is clear. The distant green trees and the water is the edge of the clouds and the stone ripples are clear. The thousands of dots on the blue peak are light. The water is the edge of the clouds and the stone ripples are clear. The clear sunset is red. The trees are the edge of the clouds and the stone ripples are clear. The alley is the spring and the stone ripples are clear. The small path faces the bridge of the Pine Gate Temple. The fishing boat under the bright moon is far away. The snowy waves follow the tide in the dark. This poem was an excellent poem regardless of whether it was read forward or backward. When the two were combined, the meaning was naturally different. Not only could it be read forward, but it could also be read backward. Moreover, it was still neat and appropriate. It could be seen that Li Xianzi's writing skills had reached the pinnacle in terms of choosing words and constructing sentences. If it was read forward, it could be said that it was the moonlit night scene and the river was at dawn. If it was read backward, it could be said that it was read from dawn to the fishing boat singing in the evening. The crowd could even imagine the two scenes at the cold mountain temple outside the city. Could a poem be written this way? They finally understood what great scholar Chu meant when he said it was an eye-opener. They had lived for dozens of years, and this was the first time they had seen such a marvelous poem. It was no wonder that Zhao Xiuwen gave up after taking a look at it. Even if he was given 10 or 100 incense sticks, he might not be able to do it, let alone one incense stick. At this moment the officials looked at Li Yi in a different way. He could write such a poem that had never been seen before. Even if he had prepared beforehand, how bad could his poetic talent be? Perhaps they really had a chance of winning today's contest. Chapter 468. Su Shi's Jinshan Temple was a masterpiece among palindromic poems. Although it was not as well known as most of his poems, it still had a high status in the professional field. The development of poetry in this world was far inferior to that of the world Li Yi was familiar with. Because of the uniqueness of this poem, the shock it caused was even greater than those top works. It did not express emotion or ambition. It was purely to show off. Bite me if you don't like it? Zhao Xiuwen saw this, so he simply admitted defeat to avoid wasting time. Of course, he could write a poem that did not lose to it, but to write a poem that could be read vertically and vertically, with a good artistic conception, was not something that could be completed in a short period of time. In fact, he was not even sure if he could write it. If this poem really came from the young man in front of him, then his mastery of words must have reached a terrifying level. Jingdi's expression was calm. He sat on the dragon throne and gave people a feeling that everything was under his control. The officials were relieved. The emperor was indeed the emperor. It turned out that he had a plan to replace Wei Sai at the last minute. The third prince of the Qi kingdom patted Zhao Xiuwen's shoulder and comforted him. I did not expect Li Xianzi to have such profound attainments in poetry at such a young age. Just try your best. There is no need to worry too much about winning or losing. I'm very happy to have met an interesting opponent. Zhao Xiuwen smiled as if he did not care at all. At this time, the two eunuchs had already lit their incense sticks. The third prince of the Qi kingdom had drawn the first stick. The second one was naturally the Jing kingdom's. Prime Minister Shen casually drew a stick from the bamboo tube. After glancing at it, he looked at the two and said, Duanwu. It was not difficult to write poems about festivals. Every year there would be countless of them. But because they were so common, it was especially difficult to stand out from them. The atmosphere in the hall was quiet. The officials held their breath and tried not to make a sound. Zhao Xiuwen closed his eyes again. The officials in the court had already investigated him. When he wrote poems, he liked to close his eyes and meditate. When he opened his eyes, it was the time when the poem was completed. Because it was too quiet in the hall, the sudden footsteps were especially clear. When the crowd saw Li Xianzi walk to the table and start writing, their expressions froze again. From the time Prime Minister Shen announced the topic to the time he walked to the table, it was only a few breaths of time. In such a short time he actually thought of a poem? No matter how high his attainments in poetry were, it was impossible for him not to think. All the officials had strange expressions on their faces and sighed inwardly. Even if His Majesty really had made arrangements, this county magistrate Li should have acted more realistically. With such poor acting skills he couldn't even fool them, let alone the people of the Qi kingdom. His Majesty really found the wrong person this time. Which of the officials couldn't act better than County Magistrate Li? Under everyone's gaze, Li put down his brush and said in his heart, Mr. Dongpa, I'll borrow your poem again. I hope you won't mind. The eunuch immediately hung up the paper, the ink still wet. This time, when the officials looked over, their expressions were completely different from before. Different from the previous poem, this one didn't deliberately show off. Whether it was the content or the form, it was recognized by countless people as the mainstream. Wanshi Sha Duanwu. Light sweat slightly penetrates the blue wan, Ming Dynasty Duanwu bats fragrant orchids. Fragrant blossoms fill the clear river. Colorful threads gently wrap around the red jade arm. Small talismans hang diagonally from the green cloud. Beautiful people meet for 1,000 years. The few lines of the poem not only vividly displayed the folk customs of the Duanwu festival, but the last line was the finishing touch. Beautiful people meet for 1,000 years. This was probably the longest and truest promise, right? He just didn't know who this beauty was. Could she be his wife? No one knew when Zhao Xiuwen had opened his eyes, but he didn't immediately start writing. Instead he walked over to Li Yi, cupped his hands and asked, I am Zhao Xiuwen. May I know your name? All the officials were surprised. At this moment, Zhao Xiuwen didn't write a poem, but came over to get close to Li Yi. Li Yi cupped his hands. He thought to himself, hurry up and write. Once you're done we can end this boring competition. If this goes on, Master Dongpa's coffin won't be able to hold on any longer. As expected, Li Xianzi Li. I should have known. Zhao Xiuwen didn't look surprised at all. He sighed and took out a thin book from his sleeve. He said, I originally thought that among the younger generation, no one could compare to me in poetry. It wasn't until I passed by Qing and Prefecture and bought this Mingyu collection that I realized how foolish I was. Ever since then, I have often read Brother Li's poems and my emotions have been stirred up. I can't sleep at night. I think a true immortal of poetry is nothing more than this. I've always wanted to be friends with Brother Li, but I've never been able to do so. I didn't think I'd meet you at such an occasion. Fate really does make fools of people. Zhao Xiuwen's words left all the officials speechless. Even though Zhao Xiuwen was from Qi, all the officials recognized his poetic talent. He had defeated Wang Zhong, the poetry demon. Many scholars of the Jing kingdom had been defeated by him. But such a person had described himself as a frog in a well. How much praise was this for Li Xianzi? Every word he said was praising Li Xianzi and was not stingy with his choice of words. The meaning behind his words was that he had admitted defeat in this competition. In this case, the Jing kingdom had lost one round and won another. Although it was a draw, it had given them a chance to catch their breath. This was extremely important. I'm not as good as you, Zhao Xiuwen said seriously as he looked at Li Yi. The Qi kingdom's ambassadors' faces darkened. One of them was about to speak, but the third prince glared at him and he swallowed his words. Li was also surprised. Zhao Xiuwen had said such words in front of the Qi kingdom's ambassadors and the officials of the Jing kingdom. This was beyond his expectations. Had he met a fan? He had to admit that regardless of whether it was the third prince of the Qi kingdom or the person in front of him, even if they were from different camps, it was difficult for him to feel any ill will towards them. Thank you for letting me win. Li cupped his hands again. The Qi kingdom's third prince nodded his head at Li Yi. Then he lifted his head and said, Your Majesty, we have lost this competition. From the beginning to the end, he had not asked a single question of Zhao Xiuwen. As the Qi kingdom's third prince's words fell, there was an immediate uproar in the court. No one had expected that this competition of poetry would have such an outcome. There was no judgment, no debate. Li Xianzi was direct and efficient. Zhao Xiuwen had admitted defeat twice and won so easily. At a time when the people of the Jing kingdom were in low spirits, this victory was undoubtedly an uplifting event. The imperial court's reputation had been restored. Not long after, the officials walked out of the main hall. At the same time, news spread from the palace gates. Chapter 469. Li Yi, the Prince of Chang'an County, had always been a special figure in the imperial court. He was highly favored by the emperor. He was skilled in mathematics, Buddhism, and medicine. The divine punishment that he offered caused the Jing kingdom to no longer be weak in terms of military strength. When faced with the powerful Qi kingdom, they also had the ability to fight back. But at the same time, he was the first to beat a prince in the imperial palace in front of all the officials, disregarding the rules of etiquette. All along, the officials in the imperial court had different opinions about him. But this time, even the officials who were close to the king of Shu had to praise him sincerely. Well done. Because the significance of this contest had already surpassed the contest itself. After several defeats, the prestige of the imperial court among the people had dropped significantly. If the imperial court were to lose 2 battles in a row in this kind of competition between countries, it was likely that the people of the world would be utterly disappointed in the emperor and the imperial court. This was also the objective that the people of Qi kingdom wanted to achieve. Now, Li Xianzi had slapped away their conspiracy with a resounding slap. Weren't the people of the Qi kingdom good at writing poems? Now even he admitted that he was far inferior to Li Xianzi. When he left, he even shamelessly asked the emperor for one of Li Xianzi's original poems. Who would dare to say that the Jing kingdom was weak in the future? Outside the imperial palace, many people had been waiting in the distance since dawn. There were old and young people, men and women, but most of them were young. Confucian scholars made up the majority. There were students from the capital, and there were also people who had come from the neighboring counties. This was because what was going on in the imperial palace today was not only a competition between 2 people, but also a competition between countries. It was closely related to each and every one of them. They had lost a contest yesterday, so today's contest was particularly important. Most of them looked solemn and didn't talk. Occasionally, they glanced in the direction of the gate of the palace. After the contest, the news would definitely pass through here, so they would be the first to know. They didn't know how long they had waited. At a certain moment, a heavy sound finally came from the front. The guards at the gate of the palace opened the gate, and all the officials came out. They were in groups of 3 to 5 talking and laughing. They looked very relaxed. When the people who were waiting nearby saw this scene, they were slightly startled. Then, as if they realized something, a trace of joy quickly appeared on their faces. Not long after, a few fast horses galloped out from the edge of the crowd. The news that the Jing kingdom won the second round of the competition spread in all directions. "How did the two of you get to know the third prince of the Qi kingdom?" Emingzu asked as she looked at Li Yi and Li Xian without moving her chopsticks. Li Xian was a little depressed and said, "How would we know that the guy we met in the Jadeite courtyard was the third prince of the Qi kingdom? I thought he was a nice guy." Princess Shining took a big bite of rice. She raised her head and a grain of rice stuck to the corner of her mouth. She asked curiously, "What kind of place is Jade Courtyard? Is it fun? Take me with you next time." Prince Jin Li Han didn't care about this. It was not easy to get a chance to eat with them. If he didn't seize the time to eat more, he didn't know when he would have the chance to eat again. Li Yi remembered that he had said to Rui that he would go back for dinner in the morning. It seemed that he would have to wait until the afternoon. He put some food in little Yongning's bowl and looked at Emingzu and said, "That's the third prince of the Qi kingdom. Why did he come to the capital?" Emingzu shook her head and said, "Although the third prince of the Qi kingdom is the third prince, he is the most capable one among all the princes of the Qi kingdom. He is deeply trusted by the king of the Qi kingdom and has a high prestige in the hearts of the people of the Qi kingdom. The series of things against the Jing kingdom should be planned by him." Li Yi nodded. The third prince of the Qi kingdom did have his outstanding points. He came to the Jing kingdom with a few people with the envoy group of the Qi kingdom and forced the old emperor and all the officials in the court step by step. It was enough for him to boast for the rest of his life when he went back. Not to mention other things, if Li Han hadn't been lazy and read all the contents of the booklet, the old emperor and the officials would have jumped into the big pit they had dug. Thousands of years later, when middle school textbooks talked about the equal ratio of numbers, this would be an interesting example. The name of the old emperor would definitely be more famous than that of the founding emperor of the Jing kingdom. Of course, the most terrifying thing about the third prince was not this. Obviously they were enemies, but Li Yi didn't feel much hatred or hostility toward him. Was this the legendary personal charm? If he became the king of the Qi kingdom in the future, the Jing kingdom would be in danger. The king of Shu was an idiot who only knew how to hold parties. He couldn't be compared with that young man at all. If this went on, once the old emperor died, the Jing kingdom would not be far from destruction. "County Magistrate Li, His Majesty wants to see you." The reason why Changde wasn't well liked was because he always appeared at the most inopportune time. Li put down his chopsticks, touched Yongning's head and said, "I'll go out for a while. I'll be back soon." Then he stood up and walked straight outside. Changde had never seen him so straightforward. He was a little stunned for a moment. "Let's go. What are you waiting for?" Standing outside the door, Li looked back at Changde and urged him. "County Magistrate Li seems to be in a hurry this time." Changde's voice was always gloomy. "Why do you think His Majesty wants to see me this time?" Li asked curiously. Changde said indifferently, "How can servants like us know His Majesty's thoughts?" A eunuch who didn't know how to figure out His Majesty's thoughts was not a good eunuch. With Changde's intelligence, how did he climb to the position of Chief Chamberlain? Could it be that he got in through the back door? Could it be that His Majesty is so happy that he wants to reward me with something after winning the competition with the people of the Qi kingdom? I don't want money this time. If I can become a duke, I can consider it. Changde glanced at him and said, "Stop dreaming. Go in." When Li Yi walked into the Hall of Diligent Government, Emperor Jing was not reading the memorials. Instead, he stood in front of a table and looked at something with interest. All right, there is no one else here." Emperor Jing waved his hand and turned to look at Li Yi. He asked, "How did you come up with this poem in such a short time?" Li Yi glanced at the table and found that it was the first palindrome poem that he had just copied. The second one had been taken away by Zhao Xiuwen in front of the officials. Li Yi thought in his heart that great layperson Su's coffin must be suppressed. He said, "Your Majesty, I don't know why, but when I saw the title, this poem suddenly appeared in my mind." Emperor Jing was stunned for a moment. He shook his head and said, "Forget it. Even Zhao Xiuwen said so. I think I have underestimated you. I promised you that if you can win this competition, I will allow you to take Yongning out of the palace for a month. An emperor does not go back on his words. When this matter with the Qi kingdom is over, I will fulfill my promise." The old emperor still kept his promise. This was a good deal. As Li Yi was thinking this, he heard Emperor Jing ask again, "Are you familiar with the scriptures? If you were to go and debate with the great scholar of the Qi kingdom, how confident would you be?" Li Yi was stunned for a moment and shook his head. "Your Majesty, you know that I only know a little about poetry. I really don't know anything about the scriptures. Otherwise I would not still be a scholar. If Prime Minister Qin and so many great scholars could not do it, I would not be able to do it." Jing Di nodded his head. He was just asking casually. It would take at least 10 years to deeply understand the meaning of the scriptures, and if one really wanted to master it thoroughly, one would need to exhaust his entire life's energy. If even the grand scholar of the Hongwen school could not do it, then no one could win. In short, this time he could not pin his hopes on Li Yi. "You can leave first. I let Yongning out of the palace to treat her illness. I will not use this as a condition. When this matter is over, I will reward you. I will take my leave." Li Yi cupped his hands and turned to walk out of the hall. Emperor Jing looked at his back as he left. A thoughtful expression appeared on his face. He suddenly said, 2 months? Li Yi's footsteps stopped. After a moment, he turned his head and asked doubtfully, "Your Majesty just said, what scriptures?" Chapter 470. The so-called debate of the classics is to use the scriptures as the topic. 2 people ask questions and 1 answers. The questions are all from the Confucian classics, and the person being asked has to explain the meaning within. These classics include but are not limited to the 13 classics. When Prime Minister Qin was young, he was famous in the capital city for his debate of the classics, but he was not as good as the great scholar of the Qi kingdom. If you want to win, not only do you need to memorize the meaning of these classics, you also need to have your own understanding. Really 2 months? Li Yi asked again with some uncertainty. An emperor does not joke. Jing Emperor nodded with a faint smile. Li Yi touched his nose and pretended to be enlightened. "Your Majesty, I suddenly remembered that I seem to know a little about classics. You have to think about it carefully. Those classics are enough to fill half a room. The great scholar of the Qi kingdom has been studying classics all his life. Even the grand scholar of the Hongwen school may not be able to beat him in classics. If you lose, I will not punish you. I will allow you to take Yongning out of the palace. Just pretend that I never said anything." Li Yi secretly despised Jing Emperor. Just now he said that an emperor does not joke. In the blink of an eye, he wanted to go back on his words. If it were not for his identity, he would have spat at him with contempt. "Rest assured, Your Majesty. It happens that I have some confidence in classics." Li Yi looked at Jing Emperor and said with a smile. Jing Emperor's face finally showed a trace of seriousness. "Are you serious? 2 months? Your Majesty is also serious?" Li Yi said again. Since it was a deal, he had to confirm the chips again and again. Jing Emperor thought for a moment and nodded. "Tomorrow morning I will send someone to pick you up. If you can win for me again, I will raise your title by 1 level. You will become a county uncle at the age of 20. I am afraid that the capital will be shocked. What do you think?" "I will go back to prepare." The title of nobility was not important. Even if he were to be promoted 1 rank higher, he would only be a county earl. It was far from being comparable to a duke. Li Yi cupped his fists and prepared to leave. After taking 2 steps, he seemed to have thought of something and turned back. "What other request do you have?" Jing Di looked at him and asked. "I don't have any request." Li Yi's expression was a little puzzled. He looked at Emperor Jing and asked, "I just want to ask Your Majesty, what are the 13 scriptures? Was I too hasty this time?" Li Yi had been gone for a while. Jing Di rubbed his eyebrows and asked with some doubt. "Your Majesty, can you allow this old servant to say something?" Changde, who was usually silent in front of Emperor Jing, suddenly said. Emperor Jing waved his hand and said, "You don't have to be so polite between us." Changde thought for a while and said, "Your Majesty, do you think that county magistrate Li will agree to something that he has no confidence in?" Emperor Jing was stunned for a moment. He shook his head and said, "From the moment I began to pay attention to him until now, except for the incident where he beat the king of Shu, which surprised me, he has always been calm in doing things. He would not easily take risks if he was not 100% sure." "In that case, Your Majesty doesn't have to worry," Changde said with a smile. Jing Di thought for a while and smiled. He nodded and said, "I was thinking too much. Let's see what kind of surprise he will give me, the court officials, and the people of my Jing kingdom tomorrow." When they came back from the Hall of Diligent Government, They left a little of every dish for themselves. Li Yi ate and asked Emingzu, "How do I get to Hongwen Building?" "What are you going to Hongwen Building for?" Emingzu asked with her eyebrows raised. Hongwen Building was the National Library. Most of the people in the building were old scholars who managed and corrected books. In her opinion, Li Yi did not look like a person who liked to read. Li Yi glanced at her and said, "Your Majesty asked me to debate with great scholar tomorrow. I have to go and see what it is." Mingzhu's beautiful eyes widened. "Debate? You? What's wrong with me?" Li Yi looked at her discontentedly. "Don't look down on me. Who says that the older you are, the more powerful you are? This era belongs to the young people. Don't you understand that the later waves of the Yangtze River beat the waves in front?" Emingzu asked with furrowed brows, "Are you serious? You have already won the poetry contest. There is no point in trying to show off. Do you think you are better than Prime Minister Qin and Grand Scholar Zhou when it comes to the interpretation of the scriptures?" Li Yi snorted, "You will know how good I am in the future." Emingzu looked at him, a suspicious expression on her face. It was not his style to debate the interpretation of the scriptures with great scholar sect for no reason. She looked at Li Yi and asked, "What benefit did my father give you?" Li Yi put down his chopsticks and sighed. He looked at her and said earnestly, "What benefits can there be? As a citizen of the Jing Kingdom, you must always take the rejuvenation of the country as your responsibility. How can you disregard the honor and disgrace of the country? You must be able to stand up for the country at critical moments. Even if you have to sacrifice yourself, you will not hesitate. Did my father agree to promote you to a higher official rank?" Emingzu asked again. "Not a higher official rank, just a title. The Hongwen Building was the place where the officials of the imperial court retired, so it had always been a leisurely place. Besides a few old scholars, there were only some servants who did the chores here. Once in a while, some young officials who were disliked would be transferred here. Soon after, they would either resign or find a way to be transferred to another place. It was evident how boring it was to work here. The Hongwen Building was not as peaceful as it used to be today. The scholars were baffled as they looked at the young man walking around in the building from a distance. He didn't even read the books but merely touched the bookshelves casually. What's wrong with Li Xianzi? Why did he come to our Hongwen Building? Why is the princess by his side? What is he doing there? The books are all the scriptures. If he is reading the books, why don't I see him reading them? Is it possible that he can memorize all the contents of the books by touching them casually? I'm not sure. It's said that this Li Xianzi suffers from some kind of hysteria. It looks like the rumor is true. We shouldn't provoke him, otherwise. Thinking of the miserable fate of the king of Shu, the scholars immediately retreated more than 10 steps. What are you doing? Emingzu, who was standing beside Li Yi, couldn't help but ask, "What are you doing?" "You don't understand. The competition is tomorrow, so I need to familiarize myself with it today." As Li Yi spoke, he picked up another book. At the same time, a book appeared out of thin air on the bookshelf in his mind. Li Yi put down the book and picked up another one. Familiarize. Li Mingzhu looked at him and shook her head helplessly. No matter when or where, he always did things out of the blue and no one could guess what he was thinking. However, looking at his appearance, it seemed that he was already confident of winning the competition tomorrow. Emingzu shook her head and didn't think too much about it. Thinking that he wouldn't finish in a short while, she simply walked out of the hall and waited. The Hongwen Building was unusually quiet. Only a few footsteps could be heard from time to time. However, outside the imperial palace, the people in the capital city were already boiling because of a certain piece of news. Li Xianzi had defeated the Qi Kingdom in the poetry competition today and won back some ground for the Jing Kingdom, which made the people in the capital city heave a sigh of relief. The 2 poems he composed in the Golden Hall had already been posted. When the palindrome poems, which could be read vertically and backwards, were published, it not only blinded the eyes of countless people, but also made countless scholars exclaim in admiration. It turned out that poems could be composed in this way. In addition, some gossip that people took delight in came out from various brothels in the capital city. For example, Zhao Xiuwen of the Kingdom of Qi, who was known as the best poet in 1,000 years, did not even manage to compose a poem today. The moment he saw Li Xianzi's poem, he immediately admitted defeat and admitted that he was ashamed of his inferiority. He even asked for Li Xianzi's poem manuscript back. Of course, some people also revealed that Zhao Xiuwen was actually one of the admirers of Li Xianzi's poems. He carried Li Xianzi's poetry collection with him and could only fall asleep after reading Li Xianzi's poems several times at night. For the people in the capital city, What could be more satisfying than winning today's competition? Of course there was. They not only had to win but they had to win beautifully. They had to win so that the people of the Qi kingdom would be convinced. And Li Xianzi had achieved this. On this day, the haze and worry on the faces of the people in the capital city was swept away. There was no longer any depression in their hearts. On this day, the brothels in the capital city were almost full. Scholars and scholars recited poems and tried their best to release their passion. On this day, countless girls in the boudoir were holding a copy of the collection of the bright moon. They copied the latest poem, the Duanwu of the Huanxi Sha, and their faces were flushed as they recited the words, "Beauty meets for 1,000 years." On this day, Li Yi, the county magistrate of Chang'an, became famous in the capital city. Chapter 471. Are you still there? In the backyard of the Jade's courtyard, Fang was squatting on a stone. He hadn't heard any sound for a long time, so he asked. After a while, he heard light footsteps again. The girl said apologetically, "I don't know what happened today, but there are a lot of guests in the courtyard. I'm very busy, so I can't talk to you here." Fang smiled and said, "It's okay, you can go. I have to go back. Then tomorrow. I'll wait for you here tomorrow." The girl said quickly, and the footsteps gradually went away. Fang stood up, patted the dirt on his butt, and went back to the street. When he passed by the butcher's shop, he remembered that his wife liked to eat high-quality pork belly. She had been talking about it for several days. He walked to the front of the shop and asked the butcher, "Is this meat fresh?" The butcher was also a man with a fierce face. He patted his chest and said, "Customer, don't worry. This meat was just killed this morning. It can't be any fresher." Fang nodded, "Give me 3 caddies of pork belly." Okay. The butcher grunted in acknowledgement. He used a boning knife to cut the meat a couple of times, and then wrapped the meat with a lotus leaf and tied a rope. He said with a smile, 3 caddies 6 taels. Dear customer, please take it. I'll take a small change and count it as a silver coin. Naturally, old Fang was not short of money. In fact, although it was difficult to buy a big house in the capital, he had saved a lot of money during this period of time. He could marry 10 wives and still have a lot of money left. He could be considered a wealthy family. However, when he touched his waist, he realized that he had left in a hurry this morning and did not bring a single coin with him. The butcher saw this and guessed that he didn't bring money. He smiled and said, "Customer, did you forget to bring money? It's okay. You can take the meat first. You can pay for it next time." Fang smiled and asked, "Aren't you afraid that I'll go back on my words?" The butcher laughed and said, "That won't do. You come here every day and I don't think you're that kind of person. Besides, I'm in a good mood today. If you really want to renege on your debt, I'll give this meat to you. You're just a butcher. What's there to be happy about? Is your wife pregnant?" Old Fang took the meat and didn't refuse. He casually asked, "Alas, I still haven't gotten my wife." The butcher sighed and then thought of something else. Suddenly, a smile appeared on his face and he said, "But if you want to talk about this happy event, the whole capital is talking about it, and you don't even know about it. I'll have to tell you about it. Moreover, the people of the Qi kingdom are extremely arrogant. They've been looking for trouble everywhere in the capital city. This time, they've even gone so far as to cause a ruckus in the imperial court." A moment later, Fang was shocked. "Isn't Li Xianzi referring to my son-in-law? In the morning, I saw my son-in-law go to the imperial palace, but I didn't expect him to do such a big thing. Even the butcher on the street knows about my son-in-law's deeds?" After taking the meat and leaving, Fang didn't go home directly. There was a brothel nearby, and he planned to borrow some money from an acquaintance to pay for the meat. "Master, please slow down." Outside a brothel somewhere in the capital city, a pale-faced, frail middle-aged man was supported by a servant into the brothel. "Master, let's go back. Those people. The servant opened his mouth with a troubled expression, but was interrupted by the middle-aged man with a wave of his hand. "Don't worry. I can still bear this little curse." The middle-aged man's voice was a little hoarse, but his tone was unusually firm. Behind them, a man carrying meat walked into the brothel. He looked back and said, "Your body is so weak. Why did you come to the brothel instead of resting at home?" The servant in green was about to say something, but the man turned around and left after saying that. The master and the servant walked into the brothel and found a secluded place to sit down. As soon as they sat down, they heard several people talking around them. "This Li Xianzi has really made our Jing kingdom proud. Yes, this time, let's see how arrogant the people of the Qi kingdom can be." Say if Deputy Ma won yesterday we won't have to play anymore. It's all that Ma guy's fault. He's not good at chess but he insisted on being a hero. Hearing these comments, the servant in green was indignant. The middle-aged man's face was a little gloomy, but he didn't say anything. At this moment, there was a sudden uproar in the crowd. The master and the servant looked up and saw an old man sitting on the table in front of them. Hey old Jing, let's not talk about anything else today. Tell us how Li Xianzi won against the people of the Qi kingdom. Yes, that's it. The storytellers in the brothel not only told stories, but also talked about current affairs and court politics. After all, people in Jianghu and among the common people were all the people of the Jing kingdom, so they also had to care about the affairs of the court. In addition to gossip, there were many things that were closely related to them. The old man on the table smiled and pressed his hand down. Immediately, the noise below disappeared. Then he said, I believe everyone is very interested in the story of Li Xianzi's victory against the people of the Qi kingdom. Naturally, I'd like to talk about it. But before that, I'd like to talk about the match yesterday. The pale-faced middle-aged man raised his head slightly. After a moment of silence, the audience immediately became noisy. A loss is a loss. There's nothing to say. Just talk about Li Xianzi. Why did you mention that Ma guy? That's right. Tell us about the match this morning. We can't wait. The middle-aged man involuntarily clenched his fists and his face became even paler. The old man on the table raised his hand again to stop the crowd. He said, Of course we have to talk about the incident of Li Xianzi. But there's a hidden story about yesterday's incident. Lord Ma was wronged for no reason and was reviled by the people of the capital city. I won't be happy if I don't talk about it. Hearing this, the servant in green was stunned. The middle-aged man suddenly raised his head and looked at the old man on the table. Hidden story? Hearing this, the crowd was also surprised. Obviously, it was the first time they had heard of it. What hidden story? Did the people of the Qi kingdom play tricks in yesterday's match? Tell us. Amidst the urging of the crowd, the old man slowly said, Everyone thinks that Deputy Ma lost to the nameless old man of the Qi kingdom, but they don't know that the nameless old man is known as the chess soul. He's the true #1 chess player of the Qi kingdom. This time, he hid his name to deal a heavy blow to the morale of the Jing kingdom. Even the chess saint, Bai Yu, was defeated by him. Who else could win? But since the people of the Qi kingdom have issued a challenge, if no one steps forward, doesn't it mean that the Jing kingdom has no one capable? Deputy Ma knew that he might not be able to win, but he still stepped forward at this time. Doesn't he know what kind of infamy he'll have to bear if he loses? But he still stepped forward. Because if even he cowers at the back, there's really no hope of winning this match. It's not terrible to lose. We'll win it back eventually. But if no one in the entire capital city takes up the challenge, how will the people of the Qi kingdom mock our Jing kingdom? The old man spoke with fervor and assurance. The brothel was extremely quiet. The green-clothed servant's face was filled with joy. The middle-aged man's face was abnormally rosy, and his hands were trembling slightly. Everyone's expressions changed from doubt to astonishment, and then to anger. Many of them even had expressions of deep shame on their faces. What? Is that true? That old man is actually so powerful? I thought he was just an ordinary old man. Yeah, if no one steps forward, I'm afraid we'll be even more ridiculed. We've wronged Deputy Ma. Damn it, the people of the Qi kingdom are so shameless. If that's the case, Deputy Ma, I shouldn't have scolded him. No one doubted the authenticity of the old man's words. After all, although the brothel had opened not long ago, not only did it have exciting stories and plays, it had never made a big fuss about important matters. It was unlike other brothels that relied on making money by flaunting all kinds of untrue information. It could be considered a brothel with a conscience. After that, thinking about how they had scolded Deputy Ma for the past 2 days, the crowd naturally felt apologetic towards him. When this matter began to spread throughout the capital city, the crowd also learned of the truth of this matter through countless channels. The people of the capital city gathered in groups in front of the Ma mansion to apologize. The winds in the streets changed abruptly. Within a day, Deputy Ma turned from a national sinner to a national hero. The legendary story of Deputy Ma's fearless attitude towards power and admonishing the people to death was also widely spread in various brothels. Countless young imperial censors began to view Deputy Ma as their life idol. Of course, this was all a story for another time. At this moment, on a spacious street somewhere in the capital city, a middle-aged man's face was flushed with excitement. He rejected the servant's support and listened to the idle chatter of a few people on the street. The smile on his face grew wider. Justice is in the hearts of the people. What a good justice is in the hearts of the people. Recalling the words of the old man in the brothel, the middle-aged man stroked his chest and laughed heartily. Even the lowly actors are worried about the suffering of the country. The imperial censors in the court should often come to these places. This way they can absorb the public's opinion. As the imperial censor muttered these things in a low voice in a brothel, a few storytellers sat on two sides of a long table. At the head of the table, Old Sun slowly said, "Storytelling is not only about telling stories. We need to live up to our conscience. We can't follow the crowd and be influenced by rumors. The more it is at this time, the more we need to spread the truth. This way we can gain the trust of the customers. Your Highness, I don't know why, but within half a day the winds in the marketplace have suddenly changed. I'm afraid our plan will have to be put on hold." In a luxurious courtyard in the capital city, a middle-aged man in a blue robe spoke respectfully to a young man standing in a pavilion with his hands behind his back. "It's fine. That matter was just a chess piece I made in my spare time. I don't know when it will be used. If it fails, then it fails. It doesn't matter." The handsome young man turned his head and sighed. "However, I have to admit that they have greatly exceeded I's expectations. This is indeed the capital city of the Jing Kingdom. The wisdom of its people is far beyond that of other places." A look of regret appeared on the middle-aged man's face. At this moment, the young man spoke again. "How is the investigation on that matter going?" The middle-aged man's face turned solemn. "Your Highness, everything has been investigated. That Chang'an County Magistrate, Li Yi, is the one who created Tianfa. He is also the person that the young prince of the Jing Kingdom mentioned. First, Tianfa caught us off guard and caused us to lose 2 cities. The general who supports the state almost died in front of His Majesty as an apology. Today he defeated Zhao Xiuwen, causing our plan to be put on hold. This Li Yi is the bane of the Qi Kingdom. It was undoubtedly difficult for the people of Qi to obtain information in the capital city of the Jing Kingdom. However, seeing that the third prince valued that person, the middle-aged man even used a spy that had not been used in the capital city of the Jing Kingdom for many years. At this moment he revealed everything he knew. The young man nodded and said, "I originally thought that he had only created Tianfa. I didn't expect that this Li Yi would be so talented. No wonder Emperor Jing values him so much." A cold light flashed across the middle-aged man's face. In a low voice he said, "Your Highness, with this person around, he will always be a great threat to us. Should we?" The third prince of the Qi Kingdom waved his hand and said, "Don't always think of solving problems in this way. Even Xiuwen has praised him. I have never seen him praise someone so much in poetry. Tianfa has also caused us great trouble. Poetry, writing, medical skills, Tianfa. Such a genius, why was he not born in the Qi Kingdom? You just said that he has enmity with the eldest grandson of Prime Minister Qin of the Jing Kingdom and the King of Shu?" The third prince of the Qi Kingdom looked at him and suddenly asked. The middle-aged man nodded and said, "Yes, this Li Yi has deep enmity with the eldest grandson of Marquis Qin and the King of Shu. Just a few days ago in the Imperial Palace, he beat the King of Shu into a coma in front of all the civil and military officials. However, the strange thing is that Emperor Jing only grounded him for half a month and didn't punish him too much." The third prince of the Qi Kingdom smiled and said, "If I were Emperor Jing, I wouldn't punish him too heavily." He walked out of the pavilion and paced slowly in the courtyard as he murmured, "Although the King of Shu has no talent, he is the one who is most likely to inherit the throne among all the princes. Obviously he can't let go of this enmity easily. Prime Minister Qin is a powerful person and wholeheartedly supports the King of Shu to ascend the throne. In the future, the Qin family will become the backbone of the new dynasty. At that time, Li Yi's position in the imperial court will be somewhat subtle. However, this is not necessarily bad news for us." As soon as the young man finished speaking, his face suddenly changed slightly. With a shake of his body, he immediately moved a few feet to the side. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. At the place where he had been standing, 3 arrows were deeply inserted into the soil. The middle-aged man's face changed greatly. He immediately stood in front of the young man and shouted, "Protect the third prince." Several figures suddenly appeared in the courtyard and surrounded the young man. Then several people separated and climbed up to the roof with a few leaps. In an instant they disappeared before their eyes. Not long after, the people who had left jumped over the wall of the courtyard and threw a corpse on the ground. One of them said, "Your Highness, when we rushed over, the man had already committed suicide by taking poison." The middle-aged man said angrily, "Damn the Jing kingdom. How could they do such a despicable thing? Your Highness, I will write a letter to His Majesty now." The young man waved his hand and squatted down. He pulled off the mask of the man in black. After looking at him for a moment, he took out an arrow from the quiver on his back. Seeing the blue light on the tip of the arrow, the middle-aged man's face changed greatly and cold sweat instantly soaked his back. The young man threw the arrow on the ground and clapped his hands. He looked into the distance and murmured, "Brother, are you so afraid of me?" Chapter 472. Li spent the whole afternoon in Hongwen Library. He didn't care if it was the 4 books and 5 classics or the 13 classics. As long as it was a book related to the meaning of the scriptures, he moved it all into his library. The Confucian school in this world was similar to the one he was familiar with, but there were some differences. However, the books in the library could definitely be used, so Li decided to familiarize himself with all of them. Comparing the classics with the Great One school was definitely looking for death. But who didn't know how to cheat in this day and age? If he couldn't beat him in this way, he might as well find a piece of tofu and kill himself. When he returned home, it was already evening. After absorbing so many books in one go, his head was a little dizzy. After talking with Rui for a while, he felt abnormally sleepy. He only ate a little bit of dinner and went back to his room to sleep. What's wrong with the son-in-law? Xiao Huan went into the room to take a look, then came out and murmured in confusion. Not long after, Mississippi Lu also came in with a tired face. The servant girl went up to her and asked, "Second miss, have you eaten?" Mississippi Lu waved her hand as if she didn't want to talk and went straight back to her room. The servant girl's expression was a little strange. She didn't know what the son-in-law and second miss went out to do today. Why did they look so tired? When he walked out of the small courtyard, he saw a few maids gathered together and whispered something. They seemed to be very excited. "I went shopping in the city today. Guess what news I heard?" "What?" "Don't keep us in suspense, tell us quickly. It's about our Lord Jew. The whole capital is talking about it." Looking at the servant girl's exaggerated gestures, Xiao Huan curiously moved closer. It was a very happy thing to wake up after a good night's sleep, especially after being extremely sleepy. After sleeping for 10 to 12 hours, the first thing he saw when he opened his eyes was the first ray of sunlight shining in from outside the window. His gentle, virtuous and generous wife stood by the bed and handed him a warm towel. Of course, this was just Li Yi's imagination. The first thing he saw when he opened his eyes was an old face covered with wrinkles. The old man stood by the bed like a criminal and stared at him with a pair of cold eyes. He didn't feel happy, but the effect was pretty good. "Chief Steward Chang." Li almost jumped out of bed. After he came back to his senses, his face was full of anger as he squeezed out these words from between his teeth. Chang De looked at him and said lightly, "County Li has woken up. This saves me the trouble of calling you." After washing up, Li Yi threw the towel into the basin. He pulled Rui's hand seriously and said, "In the future, don't let that old guy in this room again. If he barges in, break his legs. I'll take responsibility if anything happens. Got it? Just don't let him in next time." Rui picked up the towel with a smile. After wringing it dry, she wiped his face and said, "That old man's leg is not so easy to break. Let's go." Li Yi turned his head around and said this to Chang De coldly, and then headed for the outside of the room. This time he had to suggest to the old emperor that he should replace him with someone else. As the chief steward of the royal servants, old man Chang had nothing to do all day. Was he worthy of the monthly salary? "Grand Scholar Zhou, it's up to you today. Today is the last round of the written examination. We are waiting to congratulate Grand Scholar Zhou. So what if he is the Grand Master of the literature sect? Grand Scholar Zhou has been studying the meaning of the scriptures all his life, so he won't necessarily lose to him." Outside the political hall, a few officials surrounded the Grand Scholar Zhou before the start of the tournament, even though the people of Qi State hadn't arrived yet. The Grand Scholar Zhou had a bitter expression on his face. He had learned the news that County Li would represent him in the competition of the scriptures the day before. He didn't know why the emperor made such a decision. It was true that County Li was talented in poetry, but the content of the scriptures was different. How could a young man in his early 20s compete with the Grandmaster of Literature of the Qi Kingdom, who was over 60 years old and had studied the scriptures all his life? Yet he saw County Li stay in the Hongwen Library for a long time and read through all the scriptures. But would he be able to memorize all the scriptures by doing so? No matter what, this was the arrangement of the emperor. The Grand Scholar Zhou had no reason to doubt the emperor. All he could do was pin his hope on County Li, even though he knew that the hope was very slim, so slim that it was almost impossible to see it. The people of the Qi kingdom are here, an official said as he glanced at the distance and saw a few figures walking in their direction. The leader was still the third prince of the Qi kingdom, followed by a few ambassadors of the Qi kingdom, and an old man whom the crowd had never seen before. The old man wore a coarse cloth, and a pair of cloth shoes with rough edges on his feet. He looked like an old farmer in the fields outside the capital. As soon as Prime Minister Qin saw this old man, an unnatural expression flashed on his face, and a few scholars standing among the officials showed a hint of embarrassment on their faces. It was this ordinary-looking old farmer who had defeated all of them in the competition of the scriptures. If the grand scholar Zhou were defeated by him today, County Li would be in a bad mood the day before. It would be meaningless to win the poetry competition with great difficulty. The third prince said something to the old man with a smile on his face. The old man didn't show any expression on his face, but the ambassadors of the Qi kingdom behind the two of them seemed to be quite arrogant. What happened the day before was merely an accident. Though the Jing kingdom was delayed by 1 day, it was merely a delay in tasting the defeat. With the old master here today, if they weren't afraid of being beaten to death, they would ask the emperor and the chancellors of the Jing kingdom loudly, "Who else is there?" Not long after the ambassadors of the Qi kingdom arrived, Emperor Jing appeared in front of the crowd. Seeing the officials walking into the hall one after another, Li Yi stood up in a corner and clapped his hands saying, "I'm done. The competition is about to start." The Princess Shining threw away the branch in her hand and stood up angrily as well, saying discontentedly, "You cheated. I was about to win." Li Yi curled his lips and pointed to the entrance of the hall, saying, "You can see for yourself if you don't believe me. Your father the emperor is here. It's not good to be late." Having said that, Jing Jiu walked toward the political hall while holding Yong Ning's hand. What a joke. As a man, he didn't need to play the game of wolf eating sheep with a 10-year-old girl. Did he need to cheat? Did he? The Princess Shining stomped her foot angrily, and followed up after the Jing Jiu after glaring at the back of Li Yi. Now that the ambassadors of the Qi kingdom have arrived, let's start the third round of the written examination. After a eunuch announced the rules of the competition, Emperor Jing didn't say anything more, and announced the start of the competition. The old man of the Qi kingdom stepped forward, and all the chancellors of the Jing kingdom looked at the grand scholar Zhou. The grand scholar Zhou lowered his head, looking at the ground with his eyes focused on his nose and his heart. Emperor Jing glanced in a certain direction and said, "Though we are debating the scriptures today, this old master is a great scholar no matter what. Li Xianzi, don't be too impolite." Li Yi curled his lips. Respecting the old and caring for the young was the traditional virtue of the Chinese people. Did he look like someone who would be impolite? No sooner had the Emperor Jing said this than the third prince of the Qi kingdom showed a hint of bewilderment on his face. The ambassadors behind him hadn't come back to their senses yet either. As for the officials of the Jing kingdom, they were even more flabbergasted. Why was it him again? Shouldn't the contestant be the grand scholar Zhou? Why did it suddenly become Li Xianzi? What was the emperor doing? Did he ask the young Li Xianzi to compete with the great scholar of the Qi kingdom on the scriptures? Did they hear it wrong? Chapter 473. Seeing the young man walking out from the crowd, the old man of the Qi kingdom finally showed a hint of emotion on his calm face. With furrowed brows, he lifted his head to look at Jing Emperor and asked, "Your Majesty, are you sure that you want this person to represent the Jing kingdom and debate the scriptures with me?" The ambassadors of the Qi kingdom also showed dissatisfaction on their faces. Old Master Meng had an honorable status. In the Qi kingdom, even the emperor had to treat him with great respect. In their eyes, even the great scholars of the Jing kingdom were far inferior to Old Master Meng. The Jing kingdom had sent out such a young man for such an important contest. Wasn't this a disgrace to Old Master Meng's status? An emperor never goes back on his words. Since I have said that I will let Li Xianzi fight, I won't go back on my word. Jing Emperor waved his hand and said, "Don't worry, old master. Our Jing kingdom will accept the outcome of this contest." Upon hearing this, the ambassador of the Qi kingdom spat in his mind, "Win or lose? Do you have any chance of winning? Your Majesty, please think twice." "Yes, Your Majesty, you can't do this. Li Xianzi is still too young. Let Grand Scholar Zhou fight." The officials all tried to dissuade Jing Emperor, ignoring the fact that the ambassador of the Qi kingdom was still present. Even though Li Xianzi had defeated the genius of the Qi kingdom in poetry the day before, the contest today was about the scriptures. It was a contest of real talent and knowledge, so they couldn't play any tricks. Don't say anything more, my officials. I've made up my mind. Jing Emperor broke all the officials' illusions. Leaning against the pillars lazily, the old generals couldn't help but twitch their lips when they saw the anxious officials. His Majesty had never disappointed the officials. Since he thought Li Xianzi could win, why couldn't he win? Li Mingze, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Personnel, didn't show any expression on his face. He didn't know how capable his nephew was from the beginning to the end. On the other hand, Prime Minister Qin did not say a word. He looked at Li Yi with a meaningful look in his eyes. No one knew better than him how terrifying the old man of the Qi kingdom was. Why did His Majesty think that Li Yi could win? The envoy of the Qi kingdom was still in the hall. The competition had already begun. Even if the envoy was extremely unwilling, he had no choice but to keep his mouth shut. They looked at the two people in the hall with despair in their eyes. One was in his 20s and was extremely handsome. The other had a face like a withered pine tree and was old. Wouldn't it be great if they could compare who was more handsome today? Forget it, at least he won one round in the theory examination, so it wasn't too shameful. If he won the combat examination beautifully, he could still get back the face he had lost. After Emperor Jing spoke, the old man surnamed Meng did not say anything more. He turned to look at Li Yi and asked, "Conquering the wise and virtuous, one who is related to the 9 clans. The 9 clans were harmonious and the people were peaceful. The people are bright and the nations are united. What do you mean?" The envoy's face began to turn solemn. From now on, the competition had officially begun. This great scholar did not make things difficult for Li Xianzi at first. He asked about a famous sentence in the first chapter of the Book of History, the classic of Yao. Anyone who had read some books would know this sentence. If Li Xianzi could not even answer this sentence, there was no need for the competition to continue. From the Book of History, the classic of Yao. Li Yi thought that this old man was quite kind. He liked this kind of question the most. He just had to read it according to the commentary on the 13 classics. Conquering the wise and virtuous, and the 9 clans were related to the 9 clans. The wise and virtuous men were employed and the people were united. The 9 clans were harmonious and the people were peaceful. Already. The people, the officials. The 9 clans were peaceful and Zhang Ming was bright. The people were bright and the nations were united. The people were bright and the nations were united. The people were bright. 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 He said that all the people in the world have changed and thus the customs are harmonious. No one was surprised by Li Yi's answer, but his choice of words made the scholar's eyes light up, because it was almost a standard answer. It was not strange for a well-read scholar to give such an answer, but it had a different meaning when it came from the mouth of a young man. At least they knew that Li Xianzi's attainment in the classics was much better than they had imagined. The old man surnamed Meng nodded with a trace of appreciation on his face, but he did not speak again. The answer of the young man in front of him was really impeccable. Whether it was the interpretation or the choice of words, he could not find any fault. Li Yi was naturally familiar with the rules of the competition. If the old man did not ask, it was his turn. Since the old man had been so kind to him, he naturally would not make things difficult for him, so he asked, "The Marquis of Qi is happy and the wife of the Jiang family is happy. The biography of Gong Yang in the 9th month of the 3rd year of Du Quan." The old man surnamed Meng interrupted nonchalantly before Li Yi could finish. Most of the officials in the imperial court were still trying to figure out where this sentence came from. Hearing this, they lifted their heads and looked at the old man of Qi kingdom in surprise, feeling quite surprised. How familiar was this great master of literature with the 13 scripts? The grand scholar Zhou shook his head. The 13 scripts were very important scriptures, and this great master of literature of Qi kingdom must have memorized every sentence in them, so it was not difficult for him to understand them. The Marquis of Qi is happy and the wife of the Jiang family is happy. From which page, paragraph and line of the biography of Gong Yang? Looking at the old man surnamed Meng, Li Yi thought to himself, "How dare you show off?" The expression on the face of the old man surnamed Meng froze. He had already thought of what he would ask next, but now the words were stuck in his throat. The grand scholar Zhou opened his mouth wide, and the officials opened their eyes wide. They couldn't believe their ears. Could the book debate be asked in such a way? The Jing Emperor shrank his body a little behind the dragon chair. He reached out his hand and rubbed the center of his eyebrows, covering his face in the process. Before the incredulous expression of the 3rd prince of Qi kingdom faded away, a representative of the Qi kingdom had come back to his senses. He stepped forward and exclaimed, "It's outrageous. What kind of question is this? Can't I?" Li Yi didn't pay attention to the representative of the Qi kingdom. He turned his head to the eunuch who had announced the rules, asking, "Is there a rule that says I can't ask this question?" The eunuch was taken aback for a moment and then shook his head, saying, "No, no. As long as the question is included in the meaning of the script, it's fine." The officials eyed each other in bewilderment. Of course there was no such rule, but they were all scholars and they cared about their dignity. Who would ask such a question? It was meaningless to ask such a question. Yet, according to the rules of the book debate, it seemed that Li Xianzi's question was not impossible. After all, his question did not go beyond the scope of the meaning of the script. If he really had a deep understanding of the 13 scriptures, he might be able to answer this question. However, looking at the appearance of the great scholar of the Qi kingdom, it seemed that he was not that familiar with the script. The face of the envoy of the Qi kingdom turned red. After the old man surnamed Meng waved his hand, he glared at Li Yi fiercely and retreated helplessly. The old man surnamed Meng looked at Li Yi and said, "I really don't know your question. However, can you answer this question?" The officials had a strange expression on their faces. The great scholar might have been confused by Li Xianzi's question. Since Li Xianzi could ask such a question, how could he be unprepared? It seemed that His Majesty had sent Li Xianzi up this time because he had expected such a scene. It was difficult to win directly, so he resorted to a strange tactic. His Majesty was indeed His Majesty. "Old sir, is this the second question?" Li Yi looked at the old man surnamed Meng and asked. The old man said nonchalantly, "If you can't even answer your question, then according to the rules I won't lose." Li Yi nodded and said, "The Marquis of Qi is in Huan and the wife of Jiang is in Qi." From the 8th page, the 6th paragraph, the 3rd line of the biography of Gong Yangzhuan. In the era of printing, it was undoubtedly extremely difficult to write a biography. Some great Confucian scholars couldn't even write a book in their lifetime. Although these Confucian classics had been passed down for hundreds or thousands of years, they didn't have dozens or hundreds of editions like the later generations. The people of the Jing kingdom and the Qi kingdom actually read the same biography of Gong Yangzhuan. Therefore, there was only one answer to Li Yi's question. A eunuch had already brought the biography of Gong Yangzhuan, and the grand scholar Zhou confirmed that Li Xianzi's answer was correct. The old man had thought that since Li Yi could ask such a question, he would be able to answer it as well. He felt a bit angry that a great scholar was humiliated by a junior. He asked Li Yi, "In that case, tell this old man, the relationship between father and son on the inside, and the relationship between the king and his subject on the outside, it's the most important thing for human beings. The kindness of father and son, the respect of the king and his subject. Which book, which page and which line?" The officials sighed in their minds. Though Li Xianzi's tactic was ingenious, he could only use it once. If his opponent asked the same question, he wouldn't be able to answer it. The envoy of the Qi kingdom showed a contented expression. So what if Li Xianzi resorted to a strange tactic? It was no different than shooting himself in the foot. After some thought, Li Yi said with a smile, "The biography of Gong Sunqiu, page 12, paragraph 5, line 13. The old man surnamed Meng was expressionless, but the officials sighed in their minds. Even if Li Xianzi could come up with a random answer, he would be denied later and it would be of no use. Fortunately, the Hongwen house was not far from the political hall. Soon, a eunuch brought the book of Meng and handed it to the grand scholar Zhou. Shaking his head, the grand scholar Zhou said after turning a few pages, "The biography of Gong Sunqiu, page 12, paragraph 5, line 13, line 12, line 5, line 13, is the relationship between father and son, the king and his subject on the outside. It's the most important thing for human beings. The kindness of father and son, the king and his subject, the king and his subject." The grand scholar Zhou had finally realized something. He raised his head abruptly and stared at Li Yi, breathing rapidly. He didn't even notice that the book of Meng in his hand had fallen to the ground. How can it be possible? The old man surnamed Meng had finally raised his head, showing a hint of disbelief in his old, murky eyes. He strode over and picked up the book of Meng, flipping through it quickly. A moment later he closed the book slowly and took a deep breath. As he looked at Li Yi again, the expression on his face was completely different. Chapter 474. It suddenly became quiet in the imperial court, so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. Li Xianzi was able to tell the exact position of the sentence in the legend of Guoyang the first time because he had prepared for it. But how could he tell the problem of this scholar of Qi Kingdom accurately the second time? The officials didn't think that Li Xianzi had memorized all the scriptures by heart, so much so that he could recite from which page and from which line. Nobody could do this, not even the grand scholar Zhou, and not even the Grand Master of Literature of Qi State. The officials glanced at the old man surnamed Meng, wondering if Li Xianzi had colluded with this old man. If so, it would explain why the emperor suddenly replaced Grand Scholar Zhou with Li Xianzi. Yet, was it so easy to bribe this old man? While the officials were feeling doubtful, the Emperor Jing was not calm either. The reason he chose Li Yi was because he trusted Li Yi. In fact, he didn't believe that Li Yi could compete with the scholar of Qi Kingdom in the scriptures. Only Li Xian was leaning against a pillar next to the old general, idly counting the number of birds that flew across the sky in front of the palace. No matter who it was, to compete with Li Yi would be foolish if they weren't. The moment he agreed to compete with the scholar of Qi Kingdom, his opponent had already lost. You have indeed surprised this old man. The old man surnamed Meng had finally gotten serious when he looked at Li Yi. Li Yi, on the other hand, was wondering when the competition would end. There was no point in asking about it. Did it have to end only when one side admitted defeat? If this old man was shameless, he wouldn't be able to go home for breakfast in the morning. Is it my turn to ask? Li asked the old man. The old man surnamed Meng narrowed his eyes and nodded. In the third year of Emperor Wu of Qi's reign, Wei Jing, the left prime minister, used the excuse that women were disrupting the governance of the country and asked Emperor Wu to abolish the empress. When Emperor Wu and his subjects submitted their reports, Emperor Wu only said one sentence, and Wei Jing was convinced and never mentioned the matter again. Li Yi looked at old man Wei and asked, how did Emperor Wu respond to Wei Jing? The third prince of the Qi kingdom was taken aback. Then his expression changed slightly. Among the officials, many of them changed their expressions. What was wrong with Li Xianzi? Why did he ask about the affairs of the Qi kingdom? Wasn't it obvious that he was asking about the Qi kingdom? Nonsense. The old man surnamed Meng frowned and said, in the third year of Emperor Wu's reign, the Qi kingdom was founded not long ago. Empress Wenjing is a virtuous woman. How can there be chaos in the government? Ahem, Lord Meng, Li Xianzi didn't make irresponsible remarks. It's true. The third prince of the Qi kingdom coughed lightly and said. The old man surnamed Meng frowned even more and asked, why hasn't this been recorded in the history books? Which scripture did it come from? This is a secret of the royal family. All the books related to it have been destroyed. It's normal that Lord Meng doesn't know about it. The third prince of the Qi kingdom shook his head and said, Lord Meng, you don't need to ask any more. Let's continue. In the Zhengli Hall, the ambassadors of the Qi kingdom and the officials of the Jing kingdom finally saw the most unique debate they had ever seen in their lives. According to the usual procedure of the debate, one side would ask questions and the other side would answer. Then, the one who asked the question would take advantage of the other side's loopholes to attack. The scene was fierce and spittle flew everywhere. In the end, one side would be speechless and admit defeat. However, the situation today was completely different. Li Xianzi never asked the great master of literature to explain the meaning of the scripture, nor did he ask strange questions like in the beginning. But his questions were more tricky. A great master of literature couldn't answer the questions he asked, so how could he explain the scripture? Even the grand scholars of the Hongwen school suspected that Li Xianzi had fabricated the scripture. However, when the eunuch found the original text in the Hongwen school, they could only look at him as if he was a monster. He could even remember such an obscure scripture. Even if the great master of literature had a good memory, it was impossible for him to remember all the scripture for thousands of years. At this time, he could only suppress his anger in his heart and ask more and more incisive questions. The great scholars in the court all frowned. However, the result also surprised them. No matter how the old man surnamed Meng asked, Li Xianzi always gave perfect answers, so perfect that the old man couldn't find any loopholes to attack. The whole debate was orderly. The old man surnamed Meng asked questions and Li Xianzi answered. Li Xianzi asked questions and the old man surnamed Meng couldn't answer. After a few rounds, the old man surnamed Meng couldn't keep calm anymore. The expressions on the faces of the envoys of the Qi state were as if they had seen a ghost. The scene that they had witnessed today had a huge impact on them. Their old master had been firmly suppressed by that young man from the beginning to the end. What else did he not know? On the other hand, the officials of the Jing kingdom looked relaxed. If they had known that Li Xianzi was so powerful, they wouldn't have worried for so long. Judging from the appearance of the great master of literature of the Qi kingdom, it was only a matter of time before he admitted defeat. The third prince of Qi kingdom revealed a look of astonishment. He looked at the old man who had once again sunk into deep thought because of Li Yi's question. He walked to the old man's side and whispered, "Old Meng." After a long time the old man surnamed Meng raised his head and said in a low voice, "I've lost." There was no resentment or unwillingness in his voice. He had indeed tried his best, but how could the young man in front of him be so familiar with the scriptures that it was shocking? Even though he had studied the scriptures for decades, he was still far from being able to match up to him. He even had a feeling that he wasn't facing a person, but the great master of literature hall of the Jing kingdom. I didn't expect the Jing kingdom to have such a young and outstanding talent. I admit defeat. At this point the old man surnamed Meng didn't continue the debate. Since the young man's answers left him with no room to argue, how could he continue the debate? "Thank you for letting me win," Li Yi said, cupping his hands. He had thought that the great Confucian debate would be high-end and impressive, but he didn't expect it to be like this. It was an open-book exam, and the answers to all the questions could be easily found in the books. However, what Li Yi didn't know was that today's so-called scripture debate had not only exceeded his expectations, but it had also exceeded everyone's expectations. It had simply created a new era of scripture debate. In the future, when the great Confucian scholars discussed this matter, they could not help but sigh. Perhaps it was Li Xianzi who had caused the chaos in the study of scripture debate today. The old prince's task had been successfully completed. Just as Li Yi was about to leave, the old man surnamed Meng suddenly asked, "What did the martial emperor say to Wei Jing?" "Old sir, do you really want to know?" Li Yi looked at him with a strange expression. The old man surnamed Meng wasn't the only one who wanted to know. Even Emperor Jing and the officials were intrigued by Li Yi's words and looked at him one after another. "I'm all ears," the old man surnamed Meng said with a nod. "If you say another word, I'll cut off your dog head," Li Yi said with a smile. The third prince of the Qi kingdom opened his mouth slightly. After a moment, he shook his head and could only smile bitterly. Chapter 475. When the officials walked out of the political palace one after another, they were all smiling and looking very relaxed. The third round of the Confucian Classics competition ended perfectly with Li Xianzi's victory. So far, the Jing kingdom had won 2 of the 3 rounds and won the final victory of the written test. The faces of the emperor and his ministers were saved, and the gloominess of the past was swept away in the imperial palace. Although the Wushu test would be held in a few days, there was no suspense at all. The generals should be worried about a kung fu competition and a military formation deduction. According to the tempers of those generals, it would be fine if the people of the Qi kingdom lost, but if they won there was no need to go back. Li Yi, the son of Chang and County who had won 2 crucial victories for the Jing kingdom, broke into the sight of the courtiers again and again with a domineering attitude. Needless to say, in the last 2 rounds, even in the first round, if not for Prince Jin's reminder, the imperial court would have lost all its face. If they thought about it carefully, it was also because of Li Xianzi. The officials no longer doubted why His Majesty favored county magistrate Li when there were so many talented men in the Jing state. Even when he beat up the prince, it was only a punishment that was loud and small. In the situation where the situation was obviously deteriorating, he single-handedly turned the tide. Who else in the Jing state could do this? His Majesty's ability to judge people was still beyond their reach. If not for the incident with the King of Shu, Li Xianzi's future would be bright, but unfortunately, the officials of the King of Shu no longer simply hated Li Xianzi. It was a blessing for the Jing kingdom to have such a young talent. They could no longer judge him according to their personal likes and dislikes. Prime Minister Qin, although the King of Shu and Li Xianzi have always been at odds, those who achieve great things don't care about trifles. We can't lose sight of the big picture because of a small thing. Several officials surrounded Prime Minister Qin and said hesitantly, "I will inform the King of Shu about this," Prime Minister Qin said with a nod after thinking for a while. After the officials left, a trace of worry appeared on Qin Xiang's face. According to his character, was it possible for the King of Shu to forgive the past and accept Li Xianzi again? If Li Xianzi had such a thought, he would not have done such a thing in the imperial palace that day. When Prime Minister Qin thought of something, a trace of exhaustion appeared on his face. He was not in a rush to leave the palace. Instead, a eunuch led him to a certain palace. The capital was already a sea of jubilation. The news from the palace had already spread out. The Qi kingdom had been defeated again. Li Xianzi had won 2 matches and completely reversed the losing situation. He had fought a beautiful turnaround. The people of Jingdou felt proud and elated. They all went to the streets, cheering loudly and shouting the name of the Prince of Chang'an County. The roads were blocked. The government had no choice but to send runners to clear the way so that the carriages could pass. In an extremely luxurious carriage, the third prince of the Qi kingdom and the old man surnamed Meng sat facing each other. Old man Meng raised his head and asked the young man, "Your Highness, is what Li Xianzi said true?" The third prince of the Qi kingdom sighed helplessly and said, "Although it's a disgrace to the royal family, it's true. Li didn't talk irresponsibly." "How could that be?" The old man surnamed Meng frowned. The third prince of the Qi kingdom shook his head and said, "As you know, Master Meng, Emperor Wu is the founding emperor of the Qi kingdom. Since Emperor Wu, successive emperors of the Qi kingdom have made great efforts to govern the Qi kingdom. However, Emperor Wu rose in troubled times and immediately conquered the world. Naturally, he was violent. At that time, left Prime Minister Wei Jing actually wanted to support the Wei family and let concubine Xian of Wei ascend to the throne. Therefore, he joined several ministers to falsely claim that the harem was in chaos and suggested to abolish the empress. However, concubine Wen Jing was a virtuous woman who was deeply favored by Emperor Wu. How could she listen to the slander? Given Emperor Wu's temperament? At first, there were records of this incident. However, after Emperor Wu passed away, in order to protect the royal family's reputation, the sect of Wen destroyed all the records. Now it's only recorded in the royal treasury. The old man surnamed Meng was stunned for a long time. Although he had read many books, he had never come into contact with the royal treasury. He had thought that Li Xianzi was just making things up to embarrass him. Now, it seemed that Li Xianzi was much more knowledgeable than he had imagined. However, he was so young. Could it be that he had been studying since he was in his mother's womb? The old man surnamed Meng stopped thinking about this puzzling matter. He lowered his head and bowed, saying, "I'm useless and have failed to live up to your Highness's trust." "Lord Meng, you're exaggerating." The third prince of the Qi kingdom hurriedly helped him up and said, "This is not Lord Meng's fault. It's just that Li Xianzi. Alas, if only the Qi kingdom had such a great talent. How great would it be?" He raised his head with a hint of expectation in his eyes. The celestial punishment artifact really shouldn't be in the hands of the Jing kingdom. If the Qi kingdom can get it, the unification of the world will be just around the corner. Then he smiled again and said, "However, we've gained a lot. I didn't expect the king of Shu of the Jing kingdom to have such a grudge against Li Xianzi. In this case, all we need to do is wait. If we can bring him under our banner, we won't have to worry about our success." The old man surnamed Meng didn't interrupt this topic. He pondered for a moment and said in a low voice, "I heard that the first prince's men have chased him to the Jing kingdom. Is that true?" The third prince of the Qi kingdom withdrew his gaze and sighed, saying, "My brother, the first prince, is still worried about me after all. The first prince has no tolerance for others. How can he be the emperor? When I return to the Qi kingdom, I must submit a memorial to his majesty." Their voices gradually became lower and lower until they couldn't hear anything outside the carriage. When Prime Minister Qin stepped into a palace, the king of Shu was lying on the bed, engrossed in a book in his hand. "Your Highness, do you feel better?" Prime Minister Qin walked over and asked. The king of Shu raised his head. When he saw the visitor, he immediately put down the book and sat up with his hands supporting his body. He said hurriedly, "Prime Minister Qin, why are you here? Sit down quickly." Someone served tea for Prime Minister Qin. Prime Minister Qin waved his hand and stood by the bed. He looked at the king of Shu and said, "Your Highness, you should know what happened in the palace in recent days, right?" "How could I not know?" The king of Shu smiled and said, "If it weren't for my illness, I would also like to see the expressions of the Qi kingdom after they lost. I can't help but feel happy when I think of what they did in the capital city and what happened today." Prime Minister Qin glanced at him and asked, "Your Highness, do you know that if it weren't for Li Yi, the county magistrate of Chang'an, the Jing kingdom would have lost today?" The king of Shu sighed and said, "County magistrate Li turned the tide and restored the dignity of the Jing kingdom. He is indeed a pillar of the country. Although I had some minor conflicts with him, they are nothing in the face of the righteousness of the country. Your Highness, I'm very relieved that you can think this way." A hint of admiration appeared on Prime Minister Qin's face. He nodded and said, "Your Highness, rest well. I'll take my leave first." When he walked out of the palace, Prime Minister Qin took a deep breath. The change in the king of Shu was indeed an unexpected gain for him. After this incident, although he had lost face, it was not without benefits for the king of Shu. At least he had grown a little and seemed to be able to take on great responsibilities. Prime Minister Qin walked down the stone steps. Inside the palace, the king of Shu still had a smile on his face, but his right hand was tightly grasping the brocade quilt beside him. The veins on the back of his hand were bulging, looking extremely terrifying. Rip. A few long tears appeared on the brocade quilt. Chapter 476. Be more diligent these 2 days. Clean up the house from top to bottom. If you do a good job, you'll double your monthly salary this month. When the servants and maids of the Viscount's mansion, no, the Earl's mansion heard this, their hearts began to beat faster, and even their eyes turned red. Oh my God, it was only the beginning of the month and the monthly allowance had already been doubled. If it continued to increase at this rate, the monthly allowance they would get would be more than what they usually got in a year. In fact, the monthly allowance set by the old steward was just for show. If they met a master who would double the monthly allowance at the slightest disagreement, they would be ridiculed if they still got double the monthly allowance at the end of the month. Li Yi walked around the courtyard and waved at old Fong, who was about to go out. He said, "Old Fong, get someone to cover the corners of the tables, the corners of the wardrobe, the doors. These places that are easy to knock and trip over. Young master, it's not like we have nothing to do. Why do we wrap these things?" Fong said, curling his lips. "Just do it. Don't talk so much nonsense. If you ask one more question, you don't have to go to the city to work tomorrow. Why don't you take care of the brothel at the entrance of the village?" Fong's face suddenly changed and he said hurriedly, "Wrap it, I'll go now, I must. It'll be terrible if I trip and fall on the ground." Seeing Fong running out in a panic to find someone, Li Yi sat on a stone bench in the yard, drinking tea and resting. Mississippi Lu had not been seen for the past few days, and Rui and Xiao Huan had gone to the city to buy things. He had been directing people for half the morning, and he was indeed a little thirsty. The old emperor was indeed a man of his word. On the second day after the written examination, after all the officials had left the court, he became the county count of Chang'an. However, apart from the promotion, the increase in his salary, the doubling of his territory, and the promotion of his title of nobility, there didn't seem to be much use. But these were not important. The important thing was that Princess Yongning would come here in a few days for treatment. As for the upcoming Wushu examination, who cared about the people and the courtiers talking about it? After sitting down for a while, Fong came in again and said, "Young master, there is someone outside who says he is your friend. He is waiting at the door." After saying this, Fong seemed to think of something and added, "He brought a gift and it seems quite heavy. Then hurry and invite him in. To have friends come from afar, no matter how far they are, they must be killed." It was a joy, especially for friends who had brought gifts and were very sincere. They must not be neglected. People like Li Xian, who never brought gifts and always liked to steal things from home, weren't welcome on the list. "I came to visit without an invitation. I hope you don't blame, Brother Li." When the third prince of the Qi kingdom stood in the courtyard and cupped his hands towards him with a smile, Li Yi's expression was somewhat startled. He did not expect that he was the one who came to visit with such a generous gift. "Why, Brother Li, do you not welcome me?" the third prince of the Qi kingdom asked with a smile. Li Yi finally came to his senses and stretched out his hand saying, "Please. What is the purpose of your visit today, third prince?" In the living room the two of them sat down. After a maid served tea, Li Yi went straight to the point. He had only met the third prince of the Qi kingdom a few times. Although he did not have any ill feelings towards him, due to their opposing statuses, they could not be considered friends. Logically speaking, the third prince should be gnashing his teeth in hatred for him for ruining his plans, right? But the third prince did not seem to care at all. At least, he could not guess what he was thinking. The third prince of the Qi kingdom waved his hand and said, "Brother Li, there is no need to be so formal. There is no third prince here. There is only Zhao Yi." Li Yi only knew that Zhao was the surname of the Qi kingdom. This was the first time he heard the name of the third prince. He was even more puzzled. This third prince acted like he was very familiar with him. But he did not seem to know him that well. Zhao Yi smiled and said, "Brother Li, you don't have to worry. I am not a narrow-minded person. Brother Li won the 2 matches fair and square. Even Xiao Wen and old Mr. Meng praised you. We have underestimated the people of the world. It is not unjust that we lost the 2 matches." Li Yi did not know what to say. Could it be that the third prince had sent such a generous gift just to get close to him? "Third prince, if you have something to say, please say it." Li Yi spoke again. After all, he still had to live in the Jing kingdom. It was not suitable for him to be too close to the third prince. If it were not for the fact that Li Yi did not have a bad impression of him, and that he admired him a little, he would have asked Fang to send him off long ago. The third prince seemed to have a good personality. Li Yi had discovered this the first time he had seen him. Ever since he stepped into the courtyard, none of his expressions or movements had made Li Yi feel uncomfortable. Talking to such a person would naturally give one a feeling of being bathed in the spring breeze. It does not matter whether Brother Li believes it or not. I really want to be friends with Brother Li. Zhao Yi looked at him and said, I have seen many young talents. But after meeting Brother Li, I finally understand what it means to be a genius. To tell you the truth, Brother Li was not born in the Great Qi Kingdom. Instead, you were born in the Jing Kingdom. I'm very sorry. Third Prince, you flatter me. Li Yi had to admit that the third prince was very good at praising people. When he spoke the truth, his expression was sincere and his attitude was touching. Although he knew that the third prince was a prince of the Qi Kingdom, Li Yi's impression of him continued to rise. If the Qi Kingdom and the Jing Kingdom were not at odds, you and I would definitely be best friends. Zhao Yi looked at Li Yi and said, Unfortunately there are no ifs. Li Yi sighed and said, That may not be true. Zhao Yi smiled and suddenly asked, I heard that there is some discord between Brother Li and Qin Yu, the eldest grandson of Prime Minister Qin and the King of Shu? Li Yi turned his head and looked at him. Zhao Yi did not wait for him to answer. He smiled and said, No matter how you look at it, the King of Shu is the prince most likely to inherit the throne. In the future, the Qin residents will certainly be like the sun in the sky. I do not know why Brother Li has enmity with these two people. Zhao Yi paused and looked at him with a slightly serious expression. I just want to let Brother Li know that whether that day will come or not, there will always be a place for Brother Li in the Qi Kingdom. Zhao Yi looked into Li Yi's eyes and said seriously. He took out an object from his bosom and put it on the table between them. In the Qi Kingdom, seeing this object is like seeing me. Brother Li, keep it. Li Yi looked at the dragon-shaped jade pendant on the table thoughtfully. At this moment, Zhao Yi stood up from his chair and sighed, I've stayed in the Jing Kingdom for a long time this time. I'll be leaving tomorrow. It's a pity that I can't catch up with you for long. I hope I can see you again one day. I still remember that Brother Li still owes me a meal. He said again and turned to leave. No. Li Yi shook his head and pointed at Li Xian, who was walking in from outside, and said, The person who owes you a meal is over there. Chapter 477. Imperial Uncle actually agreed to let Yongning leave the palace. How did you do it? Li Xian strode in from outside, followed by a guard carrying 2 food boxes in his hands. He had just finished speaking when he saw the young man standing opposite him. He was stunned and blurted out, Why are you here? The third prince of the Qi Kingdom, Zhao Yi, was also stunned, but then he cupped his hands and said with a smile, Crown Prince Li Xian, what a coincidence. At a square table in the hall, Li Xian pointed at the dishes he had brought, which were prepared to go with wine while chatting with Li Yi. He looked at the third prince of the Qi Kingdom and said, Let's eat. After today we don't owe each other anything. The expression on his face was a little gloomy. Obviously, he still held a grudge for being cheated by the third prince of the Qi Kingdom. I don't think I've offended Brother Li in any way, have I? Zhao Yi didn't start eating but looked at Li Xian and said, That day in the Jade Courtyard, why didn't you say you were the third prince of the Qi Kingdom? Li Xian looked at him and said with some anger. He wasn't angry about the identity of the other party. There were so many princes in the Qi Kingdom, and he didn't have the time to hate them one by one. He was angry that he finally met a fellow who was fated to be with him, but in the end, the other party was the prince of the Qi Kingdom, who single-handedly planned a series of events against the Jing Kingdom, almost making Imperial Uncle and the court officials lose face. Before this, Li Xian's impression of him was that he was a compassionate young man who would help out when he saw injustice. The contrast was so great that the crown prince couldn't accept it. Zhao Yi looked at him and said helplessly, At that time, I didn't know that one of you was a crown prince and the other was a viscount. Li Xian felt that his question was very unreasonable as soon as he spoke the truth, but he was really depressed. He didn't want to be reasonable. He looked at Zhao Yi warily and asked, What are you doing here? Zhao Yi stood up and smiled, I will be leaving tomorrow. This time I came to bid farewell to Brother Li. From start to finish he didn't touch his chopsticks. After he finished speaking he looked at the two of them deeply and walked out the door. When he reached the door he suddenly stopped. Without turning around he said, I think I'll owe you a meal first." When the figure of the third prince of the Qi kingdom disappeared, Li Xian immediately turned to look at Li Yi and asked, "What is he trying to do here?" Just like what he said. Li Yi tore off a drumstick, took a bite and said, "Good chicken. Next time you come, remember to bring 2 more." Li Xian shook his head and looked out the door once more. He then said, "Although this fellow isn't bad, he's still a prince of the Qi kingdom after all. It's best to stay away from him. Your Highness, why did you tell Li Yi that you're leaving?" In a certain courtyard in the capital, many people were going in and out. The blue-robed, middle-aged man stood behind the third prince of the Qi kingdom and asked suspiciously, "What's going on? I feel that we will meet again in the future." Zhao Yi raised his head slightly and looked at the horizon. He said, "If father did not rush me so urgently, we would have more time to make arrangements." "It's a pity," the middle-aged man nodded and said, "The most important reason for our visit this time is to discuss the problem of the 2 cities. The third prince has indeed stayed in the Jing kingdom for too long. I'm afraid there will be different opinions in court. For His Majesty to be able to drag things out until now, I think it must not have been easy. I'm afraid that brother also contributed a lot." Zhao Yi sighed and said, "Send down the order that everyone should try to pack as little as possible. Just bring enough food for 5 days. On the road we must be careful." Then the combat examination. "Are we not going to compete?" The middle-aged man hesitated for a moment and asked. "Compete, of course we have to compete. At this point, winning or losing is no longer important. But just like the Jing kingdom's previous choice, even if we know we will lose, we cannot avoid it." The third prince of the Qi kingdom shook his head and said, "I will make arrangements for this matter. There is no need to worry. There is still one thing I don't understand." The middle-aged man bowed again and said, "Your Highness, why don't you just capture Li Yi and force him to reveal the secret of Tianfa? As long as we leave the capital, we..." The third prince of the Qi kingdom waved his hand and said, "This is the capital after all. None of the spies we sent to that place have returned. It is clear how much importance the Jing kingdom places on Tianfa. Even if we manage to force out the formula, we will certainly not be able to safely escape back to the Qi kingdom. Furthermore, Brother Li's value far exceeds Tianfa. These days the people of the capital could finally hold their heads high after being suppressed by the people of the Qi kingdom. They won the competition between countries. It was said that the third prince of the Qi kingdom had done all he could, but he did not expect that there was such an outstanding talent as Li Xianzi in the Jing kingdom. He was too ashamed to stay in the capital anymore and was going back to the Qi kingdom today." Early in the morning, the people of the capital were waiting at the city gate, waiting to see the people of the Qi kingdom make a fool of themselves. "Hey, that is the carriage of the third prince of the Qi kingdom. I really want to see what the third prince looks like." On the street of the capital, a servant in Sian couldn't help but say as he looked at the rows of carriages passing through the city gate, "What can he look like? He just has 2 eyes and a mouth. Stop looking. Young master hasn't bought what he wants. If you go back late, you won't have a good time." The servant next to the servant in Sian patted him on the shoulder and said. The servant grimaced in pain as he rubbed his shoulder. He said angrily, "Second brother Wu, I know you have great strength, but you don't have to prove it on me every time. My bones are about to fall apart because of your patting these days." All right. Your body is too weak. You need to nourish yourself. Go now. Remember to ask the cook to stew a chicken for you tonight." The servant in Sian cast a glance at the man and thought, "What a nice way to put it. Every time I have to sacrifice my body, I can get some benefits from the fat cook. But in the end it all goes to him. I can only eat the butt of the whole chicken and I can't even drink the soup." When the carriage of the envoy of the Qi kingdom passed through the city gate and disappeared before the eyes of the crowd, the people of the capital who had gathered around to watch the commotion dispersed. However, they still gathered in groups of 2s and 3s. They didn't stop talking. Just then 2 figures walked in from the city gate. The one on the left had red lips and white teeth. He was an extremely handsome young man. He turned his head to look at the tall city wall, then looked at the endless stream of carriages and horses. He then turned his head to look at the slightly older young man and exclaimed, "Young master, this is the capital." The young man stood in the middle of the street, looking at the scenery in front of him that was vaguely familiar but also very different from what he remembered. He shook his head and gently knocked on the young man's head, saying, "You're just like a country bumpkin. Don't just stare like an idiot. Hurry up and find someone." Chapter 478. "Excuse me, where is the nearest theater from here? A handsome young man with red lips and white teeth stopped a passerby on the street and asked timidly, "Theater?" The passerby waved his hand and said, "What theater? I've never heard of it." "Excuse me, excuse me, excuse me." After asking a few people in a row, they all got the same answer. The young man walked to the side of the young master and said, "Miss, everything is fine in Qing and Fu. Why did we come to the capital?" The young master glanced at him and said, "Everyone has left. What's the point of keeping us in Qing and Fu? You don't even know how to cook. We'll starve to death sooner or later. If I don't know how to cook, I can buy it outside." The young man stuck out his tongue and showed a very feminine expression. He said in a small voice, "Miss, you've learned for so long and still haven't learned anything? You're a servant girl. If you don't cook, do you want me to do it myself?" The young master knocked on his head again. "Let's find the nearest brothel first. I don't know how they've been in the capital these days." The young man covered his head and asked the next passerby with a wronged expression, "What's wrong? What's wrong with fifth young master? Are you blind? You don't even know the young master? It's your good fortune to have you follow him. Don't be so ungrateful." The servant in green glared at the young man who was spitting spittle and dressed like him. Just as he was about to explode, the man behind him pulled him back. The man laughed foolishly and said, "Ah, we are servants. It's the same no matter who we serve. Since the young master has a use for us, how can we refuse? You're quite observant." The young man looked at the man with admiration and shoved the large pile of things in his hands at him. He said, "Hurry up and follow." The man chuckled and said to his companion in green, "I'll just follow the young master. You go back and deliver the things to fifth young master. Be careful not to get back late and the young master will blame you." Looking at the back of the man leaving, the servant in green was moved. Although Wu Er was a little silly and a little gluttonous, he was a very loyal person. He could always be relied on at critical moments. At worst, he would sacrifice his body tonight and get 2 chickens from the fat kitchen maid. That would be his way of repaying him. Thinking of the fat chef, he licked his lips, and a trace of reminiscence appeared on his face. Then he turned around and strode away. The arrogant young man was now walking next to another young man and said with a flattering face, "Young master, there is a new jade courtyard in the capital. I heard that the girls there are not bad. Should we go take a look?" Seeing that the young master did not speak and was sizing up the passers-by on the street, the young man groaned inwardly. As a servant, he naturally knew the young master's hobbies. But now was a special time, and the Prime Minister had personally issued an order. If the young master caused any more trouble, not only would he be punished, but the servants would also not be able to escape punishment. Qin Yu's gaze had already rested on a young woman with an exquisite figure for a long time. Just as a pensive expression appeared on his face, a gentle voice suddenly came from beside him. "Excuse me, do you know how to get to the nearest brothel?" Having his train of thought interrupted, Qin Yu frowned and looked at the young man. After a moment, his gaze slightly narrowed and a playful expression appeared on his face. It was interesting for a woman to disguise as a man. Looking at her current handsome appearance, her true appearance should not be too bad. Go to the side, don't block the way." Without waiting for Qin Yu to say anything, the young man impatiently pushed the young man's shoulder. The young man's body staggered and fell to the ground, accidentally messing up his hair. The young man's expression froze and he said in surprise, "A woman?" Not far away, the young master hurriedly ran over and helped her up. He asked with concern, "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" The young man stood up in a panic, tied up his hair and said with grievance, "I just wanted to ask for directions and he pushed me." Qin Yu looked at the woman who was also dressed as a man, and the playful expression on his face deepened. At this moment, he had forgotten about the young woman from before. After being grounded at home for nearly half a year and being strictly disciplined these days, he had long been unable to control some kind of desire. He glanced at the young man. After a moment of shock, the young man immediately understood and hurriedly said with a smile, Sorry, it was my fault just now. You two aren't from the capital, right? You want to find the nearest brothel here? It's a piece of cake, we'll take you there. There's no need, we already know the way." The slightly older woman who was dressed as a man had seen all kinds of people, so how could she not know what they wanted to do? They were unfamiliar with the capital, and judging from the other party's attire, they were obviously of extraordinary status and could not be entangled. At this moment, the young man hurriedly blocked in front of them and said, "Hey, don't rush. This is your first time in the capital, so you're unfamiliar with the people and the place. If you meet any bad people, it's better if we take you there. The passers-by looked at them with disdain and hurriedly walked away. Bad people? Young Duke Qin, who dared to rob people on the street, was the biggest bad person in the capital. However, people had always heard that he liked to steal other people's wives. Since when did he become interested in these handsome young men? The two men behind Qin Yu also playfully stood out and blocked the way of the two people. The young man's expression slightly changed. He never thought that under the broad daylight of the capital, under the foot of the emperor, such a thing would happen. No one, including Qin Yu, noticed that behind them, there was a man with a lot of bags hanging on his body. He had an extremely surprised expression on his face. "Miss Xiao Chui," he murmured in a low voice. When he looked at the young man again, he had already guessed his identity. Wu Er's face showed a trace of hesitation. His fists hidden under his sleeves were tightly clenched, and his breathing was slightly heavy. It seemed that he was thinking about something. After pondering for a while, he sighed and looked at Qin Yu with an ominous glint in his eyes. Suddenly, a thunderous voice suddenly exploded in everyone's ears. "Hey, in broad daylight, under the clear sky, under the foot of the emperor, you dare to do such a despicable thing. Do you still have eyes for the law?" Qin Yu didn't even have time to react. In front of his eyes, a fist suddenly enlarged, and then he felt an intense pain. His whole body flew 20 feet away, and under this punch, he immediately fainted. Wu Er's face showed a surprised expression, and the fist in his sleeves slowly loosened. The young man and the delicate young man were also stunned, and they couldn't come back to their senses for a long time. The people on the street were even more shocked. Where did this hothead come from? He even dared to hit young Duke Qin. Did he not want to live? Qin Yu's two guards finally reacted. A trace of panic flashed on their faces, but they quickly regained their composure. They angrily pounced on the man who had appeared on the scene. Several banging sounds were heard. This man's skill was surprisingly good. In just a few breaths of time, the two of them were knocked down to the ground, unable to get up again. Who are you?" The young man's body trembled, and he looked at the man in fear. Hearing this, a trace of joy flashed across the man's face. He immediately said in a loud voice, "Listen up, I am Xuanzhou's Zheng Mian, ranked 23rd on the hero ranking. I saw injustice on the road, so I lent a hand. If you want revenge, come find me." They didn't know if it was an illusion, but at this moment, a strange thought suddenly surged in the hearts of countless passers-by. From beginning to end, this man beat up young Duke Qin on the street. It seemed like his motive was not to see injustice, but to shout out the words he had just said. If he only wanted to make a name for himself, then he had indeed done it. There were countless people in the capital who didn't like young Duke Qin, but the only one who dared to treat him like this on the street was this man in front of them. "Hero, you'd better leave quickly. The person you just beat up is young Duke Qin. His grandfather is the current prime minister." A passerby who was hiding in the crowd kindly reminded him. "What?" Hearing this, the man named Zheng Mian's expression changed greatly. The prime minister's grandson? Chapter 479. The man, who had a righteous expression on his face, froze on the spot when he heard the kind reminder from a passerby. The reason why he taught this playboy a lesson on the street was because he wanted to make a name for himself so that he could be ranked on the chivalry ranking. Who would have thought that this person was the grandson of the prime minister? This seemed to be a little different from his original plan. "Hero, you'd better run. You can't fight against the Qin family in the capital." Young Duke Qin, who had always been arrogant and had no regard for the law, was the scourge of the capital. Seeing him being beaten up on the street, the crowd only felt happy in their hearts. They also had a good impression of the swordsman named Zheng Mian, so they kindly reminded him again. Because there were already many people gathered here, no one could hear them if they spoke in the crowd. "Looks like I can't stay in the capital anymore." The man secretly cursed his bad luck. He couldn't afford to offend anyone on the street in this King capital. He wanted to pay a visit to the famous heroine Lu. If he was lucky enough to join the Lu alliance, that would be great. But now, it seemed that he had to prepare to run on his first day in the capital. However, he would offend either way, so he might as well let him vent his anger. The man scratched his head and thought about it. He felt that this was right. If he couldn't stay in the capital, he could go to Qin and prefecture. So what if it's Prime Minister Qin? Can the Prime Minister's grandson be lawless? The man snorted coldly. With a face full of righteousness, he said loudly, "This is the capital, under the feet of the emperor. Since someone is using his power to bully others, I will let him know the consequences of using his power to bully others." The burly man kicked Qinyu on the ground like a ragged sack. After a series of punches and kicks, he laughed and said, "Remember my name well. I am Zheng Mian of Xianzhou, ranked 23rd on the Hero Earth ranking." After he finished speaking, he quickly flashed into the crowd and soon disappeared. Hero? He knew that the Qin family was powerful, but he still offended young Duke Qin. In the hearts of the crowd, they no longer thought of him as a brute. He was a true hero worthy of the name of a hero. They immediately felt deep respect for him. Zheng Mian of Xianzhou, they silently remembered this name in their hearts. The officials always appeared a long time after they were supposed to appear. Seeing little Duke Qin covered in wounds, they naturally didn't dare to be negligent. A few people immediately went to find the culprit, and another person was sent to inform Qin Manor as soon as possible. The rest of the people carried little Duke Qin and ran to the nearest medical center. "The place you're looking for, just follow this road all the way and you'll find the second hostel." The man named Wu Er followed behind them. When he passed by the woman dressed as a man, he whispered something to her. The young woman dressed in men's clothing watched as the burly man quickly left. The surrounding people began to turn their gazes to them. She immediately took the youth beside her and left. Only when their figures disappeared did everyone retract their gazes and began to discuss in whispers. "Sigh, that hero sure has guts. Other than Li Xianzi, only this hero dares to treat Duke Qin like this in the capital. To tell the truth, it was so King satisfying to watch just now. Say, don't tell me these noble families all know how to play? Doesn't this little Duke Qin like other people's wives? When did he become interested in such a handsome young master? Those are clearly two Xiaonyang's sons. Are you blind?" Young Duke Qin was beaten half to death on the streets of the capital. This could truly be considered a super explosive piece of news. Even the hero named Zheng Mian became famous in the capital. There were even people who specially went to inquire about the hero ranking he spoke of and discovered that there really was such a strange ranking in a hostel outside the city. For a moment they were interested. At that time, a number of people went out of the city together. In a newly built hostel in the city, Wan Ruoqing walked out with a tired expression. After overcoming many difficulties, the several hostel in the capital were finally on the right track. These days she had to attend to everything personally, so she was indeed a bit tired. In front of her, two figures walked over. Wan Ruoqing stood to the side and made way for them. Suddenly she was hugged by the young man who walked in. Her expression immediately changed. Just as she was about to speak, she felt a strange feeling from her chest. It seemed to be a bit familiar. She seemed to have thought of something and immediately looked over. "Haha, I scared you." The young man's face revealed a happy expression, but he didn't let go of her. Why are you here?" Wan Ruoqing's face showed a surprised expression as she looked at him and said, "These days there have been many things to do in the hostel. Fortunately you came here to help me." On the soft grass, Wan Ruoqing and Zheng Zimo walked side by side and said with a smile. Xiao Chui and Xiao Zhu were following behind the two of them, talking mysteriously about something. A little further away there were several strong men following them from afar. "I'm not like someone who is comfortable being a hands-off shopkeeper." Zheng Zimo curled her lips and said, "This place looks good. Let's do it here." Wan Ruoqing smiled helplessly and said, "It's not spring now. Why do you want to fly a kite?" "I've wanted to fly a kite for a long time." Zheng Zimo said with some anger, "At that time we were busy with the hostel in Qingyan Prefecture. You have forgotten how many times you promised me, but you didn't fulfill it even once. Today's weather is good. If I want to fly a kite, I fly it. What does it have to do with the season? But you?" Wan Ruoqing looked at her, and her expression became even more helpless. She wanted to say that even if they wanted to fly a kite, there was no need to make the kite look like her. Zheng Zimo's painting skills were amazing, and she was proficient in that kind of three-dimensional painting. Her painting was very realistic. When the kite was spread on the ground, Wan Ruoqing seemed to see another version of herself. The feeling in her heart was naturally difficult to describe. "I think this is very good. Xiao Chui begged me several times before I made one for her." The sun was warm today and there was a gentle breeze. Zheng Zimo let Xiao Chui carry the strange kite. She ran for a while and easily sent the kite into the sky. "Sister Ruoqing, you really flew into the sky." Xiao Zhu walked over with an envious expression. Zheng Zimo looked at the sky with some pride and said, "How is it? Doesn't it look beautiful like this?" After she finished speaking, she suddenly felt her hand was empty before anyone else could answer. When she looked down she couldn't help but scream. "What's wrong?" Wan Ruoqing looked at her and asked curiously. Oh, I forgot to tie a knot at the back. Zheng Zumo ran forward anxiously. The kite flew away, hurry and chase after it. The men in charge of their safety saw this and looked at each other in shock, but they could only follow them to chase the kite. At this time, outside the capital, there was an ordinary minister's residence. Although it was daytime, the door was closed. There were only 2 gray-clothed servants outside, looking around vigilantly. In the spacious courtyard of the residence, there was a dense mass of people kneeling on the ground. There were more than 100 densely packed heads. Looking at their clothes, most of them were ordinary villagers. It was unknown why they were gathered here, but their expressions were extremely pious as they knelt on the ground, motionless. At the very front of the crowd there was a platform that was half a foot high. A purple-clothed man sat cross-legged there, looking down at the crowd. He slowly said, "After entering my holy church, as long as you are sincere and believe in the Empress will bestow good fortune upon you. She will protect you from disease and calamity, and after death, you will not fall to the ground. Now close your eyes, I will guide you." After the man in purple finished speaking, the expressions on the faces of the people became even more pious. They closed their eyes and said loudly, "Thank you, envoy." After an unknown amount of time, the man in purple spoke again. "The guide has been completed. From now on you belong to the holy religion. The Empress will protect you. Now you can open your eyes and stand up." As soon as his voice fell, the people raised their heads at the same time and slowly stood up in unison. The man in purple nodded slightly. Just as he was about to speak, there was suddenly an exclamation from below. "Look, what is that?" When the person at the very front pointed to the sky in the distance, everyone's eyes looked over. High up in the sky, an extremely beautiful woman was standing on the clouds, looking at them with a smile. Such a miraculous scene caused everyone's faces to reveal a look of shock. This is the spirit of the Empress." Suddenly, someone revealed an excited expression and loudly said. He kneeled on the ground again and kept kowtowing. "The Empress, it's the Empress. The Empress is here." But not long after, 2 people, 3 people, 10 people, 100 people, all of them kneeled on the ground, their faces solemn and solemn. They were unprecedentedly pious. The man in purple suddenly turned his head, just in time to see a figure flash in the clouds. In that instant, his pupils shrank. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.